Hello, my YouTube audience, welcome back to Crime Whisper, the channel where chilling true crime stories accompany your moments of stillness. Before we dive in, I'd love to know where are you watching from, and what time is it for you? Drop your answers in the comments, and as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow now. Let's get right into tonight's haunting story. Story 1. The Murder of Kun Yi, South Korea, 2014. In 2014, one of the most shocking and senseless crimes in South Korea's recent memory unfolded in the heart of Seoul, a tragedy that would leave a city in disbelief and a nation in mourning. The perpetrator was 29-year-old Lee Jae, a man who, on the surface, lived a quiet, ordinary life, raised in a middle-class neighborhood. Lee worked as a software engineer for a small firm. His coworkers described him as intelligent but distant someone who kept to himself and rarely formed close connections. But behind that mild-mannered exterior, darkness was quietly festering. Lee had struggled with mental health issues since his teenage years. He suffered from depression and anxiety, yet never sought professional help. His isolation only deepened with time, and despite his efforts to appear normal, he was quietly unraveling, plagued by feelings of inadequacy, anger, and loneliness. In the summer of 2014, Lee's fragile state of mind finally began to collapse. A recent breakup with a woman he had briefly dated pushed him further into despair. He took the rejection hard, interpreting it not just as the end of a relationship, but as confirmation of his own worthlessness. The emotional pain twisted into resentment, particularly toward people he believed had the happiness and success he never would. Among them was a young woman named Kun. Kun was a vibrant university student, known for her intelligence, beauty, and warm personality. She was studying economics at a top university in Seoul, surrounded by friends and full of optimism about the future. To Lee, she was everything he believed. He wasn't confident, loved, and thriving. He became fixated on her. The obsession grew for weeks. Lee stalked Kun, watching her from a distance as she went about her daily life. He convinced himself that she, this complete stranger, was the embodiment of all that he had been denied. And on the evening of August 13th, 2014, his fixation turned deadly. That night, Lee followed Kun as she left the university library and made her way toward a subway station. It was late, and the streets were dimly lit. She didn't know she was being followed. Near a quiet alley, he struckily grabbed Kun from behind and dragged her out of sight. She screamed, but the sound was drowned by the noise of the city. Without hesitation, he stabbed her multiple times with a knife he had brought with him. The attack was brutal, born not out of passion, but from cold, calculated rage. As her body lay lifeless, Lee stood over her, bloodied and breathing heavily. For a brief, twisted moment, he felt powerful, like he had taken back control of a life he thought had abandoned him. There was no remorse, only silence, but that silence didn't last. The sound of sirens in the distance snapped him back to reality. Panic set in. Lee fled into the night, leaving Kun's body behind in the alley. He wandered aimlessly through the city, consumed now not by anger, but by fear. News of the murder spread rapidly. Seoul was stunned. The randomness of the attack, the fact that Lee and Kun had never even met, made the crime all the more terrifying. Kun's family was shattered. She had been their pride and joy, a kind-hearted, hard-working daughter with a promising future. Now she was gone, and for no reason they could comprehend. Citywide manhunt followed. Investigators reviewed hours of surveillance footage and interviewed witnesses. Eventually, a clear image of the suspect emerged from camera footage, a man following Kun shortly before the attack. August 17th, just days later, police tracked Lee to a small apartment on the outskirts of Seoul. He had been hiding out, trying to avoid capture, but someone had recognized him from the news and called the police when they arrived. Lee didn't resist arrest. During interrogation, he confessed without hesitation, "I had to do it." He said flatly, "She had everything I didn't. She was perfect, and I was nothing." It was a confession that stunned even the most seasoned investigators. Prosecutors charged him with first-degree murder, though his defense team argued that he had been mentally unstable at the time. Citing his history of depression and social withdrawal, the court found that Lee had clearly premeditated the killing. This was not an impulsive act, it was a deliberate, targeted attack. Lee Jae-hun was sentenced to life in prison for Kern's family. The verdict offered only a sliver of comfort. Nothing could bring their daughter back, but they hoped her story would serve as a stark reminder of how unaddressed mental illness, social isolation, and obsessive resentment can converge into unthinkable violence. Kun's friends, classmates, and even strangers who learned of her death mourned the loss of a bright soul taken far too soon. The city held vigils, conversations around mental health and community support grew louder, yet, even now, the tragedy lingers. Lee Jae-hun's story is one of emotional decay, a man swallowed by his inner demons until he lashed out at someone entirely innocent, and Kun Ye's story is one of promise unrealized, a life full of light, extinguished by a stranger's darkness. There were no winners, only grief, only scars, and the lingering question, how many more signs must we miss before it happens again? Loved by everyone who knew her, Kun Ye was more than just a student. She was a shining light in the lives of those around. Her friends remembered her for her unwavering dedication to her studies, her natural warmth, and the way she could always make people laugh, even on their hardest days. She had recently been offered a prestigious internship, one that would have launched her into a promising future. Her parents had watched her grow into a remarkable young woman and were immensely proud of all she had achieved. They never imagined her life would be cut short in such a brutal, senseless way. As the investigation into her murder progressed, the full extent of Lee Jae-hun's obsession was slowly brought to light, and with it, the uncomfortable question, how had someone like him slipped through the cracks of society? Eventually, details of Lee's mental health history were made public. He had been battling depression since his teenage years, yet had never received proper treatment. Those who knew him described him as withdrawn, socially isolated, and emotionally detached. He was never outwardly violent, but his words, at times, hinted at deep resentment, particularly about his inability to form meaningful connections, despite the revelations about his mental health. There was little sympathy for Lee in the eyes of the public. The fact that he had targeted an innocent stranger, someone who had never even spoken to him, was incomprehensible. Mental illness, many argued, is serious and deserving of compassion, but it does not excuse murder. The line between psychological distress and premeditated violence became a key point of contention. During Lee's trial, Lee's defense argued that he had been suffering from severe psychological turmoil at the time of the killing. They brought in mental health experts who testified that he had developed a delusional obsession with Kun, convinced that her happiness and success were somehow an insult to his own misery. They portrayed him as a man spiraling into madness, a man who acted out of desperation, not malice. But the prosecution was unyielding. They painted a very different picture, one of careful calculation and chilling coldness. Lee had stalked Kun for weeks. They argued he had watched her, followed her, chosen the exact place and moment to attack. This wasn't an impulsive act driven by mental collapse. It was a planned and methodical execution. Witness after witness took the stand to speak about Kun, her ambition, her kindness, her dreams. Her parents shared the agony of losing their only daughter. Her friends described the irreplaceable void she left behind. The contrast between the vibrant life she had lived and the emptiness Lee left in his wake was stark. She had everything to live for: a loving family, loyal friends, a future brimming with hope. He took all of that away in one cruel moment for her family. The trial was a daily reopening of wounds that had never closed. They listened to every gruesome detail of the murder, reliving that worst nightmare over and over. The man who had destroyed their daughter's life had been a complete stranger, someone they had never even known existed until it was too late. Yet, amidst the heartache, they began to find a quiet sense of resolution. Justice, though it could never bring their daughter back, offered them some degree of closure. They knew the man who had taken her from them would never walk free again. Throughout the trial, Lee remained emotionally detached. His face was blank, his tone flat. He offered no apology, no explanation that could be understood. He appeared to exist in a mental fog, untouched by the devastation he had caused. The courtroom often fell into a heavy silence as his lack of remorse became increasingly evident. When the verdict was finally delivered, life imprisonment, public opinion was divided. Some believed it wasn't enough for such a brutal and senseless crime. Others argued that his mental health struggles should have been more fully considered. But for Kern's family, the sentencing brought a measure of peace. The man who had stolen their daughter's life would never have another chance to destroy someone else. Still, the emotional wounds left behind would not heal easily. Lincoln's death sent shockwaves through the city of Seoul. It forced a painful reckoning not only with the crime itself, but with the deeper issues it exposed. The dangers of unchecked isolation, the stigma around mental health, and how emotional turmoil can fester in silence until it explodes into tragedy in the aftermath. Public conversations about mental health gained momentum. People began asking hard questions. How had society failed both Kun and Lee? Could this crime have been prevented? What signs had been ignored? For her grieving parents, the answers didn't matter as much as the absence they now lived with. Their home was quieter. Her belongings remained untouched. Books she'd been reading, souvenirs from her travels, clothes folded neatly in her room. Her mother, in quiet moments, would hold those belongings close and wish with all her heart that time could turn back. No parent should ever have to bury their child. Kun. As friends struggled as well, they gathered at memorials, lit candles, shared memories, and tried to keep her spirit alive. Students at her university held vigils and wrote messages of love and remembrance. Many of them were inspired by her kindness and her dedication to making the world a better place. Her death left behind not just grief, but a sense of purpose, a collective will to confront the issues that had contributed to her tragic end. But while her story sparked awareness, South Korea's broader response to mental health remained slow. Despite progress, the stigma around mental illness persisted. Many people continued to suffer in silence, afraid to seek help for fear of being judged or cast aside. For mental health advocates, Kern's story became a rallying cry, a heartbreaking reminder of the urgent need for change. And so, the city moved forward, but not without scars. Ye's life was stolen in a moment of darkness, but her memory endures as a daughter, a friend, a student, and a symbol of everything that should have been. Her death wasn't just a personal loss, it was a call to action, a plea to listen more closely, to notice the signs, to confront the loneliness that can quietly consume a person's soul, and above all, to never forget that behind every smile and every silence, there is a story waiting to be heard before it's too late. Conclusion of Story 01. Kunye. In the aftermath of the trial, calls for reform grew louder. Mental health professionals, lawmakers, and grieving citizens demanded a deeper understanding of the risks posed by untreated psychological conditions. Yet, despite these conversations, the stigma around mental illness remained. Many continued to suffer in silence, just as Lee Jae-hoon once had. As for Lee, his life behind bars became a dark mirror of the isolation he had once chosen for himself, but could now never escape. Though he had confessed, his motives and state of mind remained the subject of painful debate. Was he a man broken by emotional turmoil he could not articulate, or a cold-blooded killer who planned every step of a young woman's murder? The truth, for many, remained unsettlingly unclearly. Received psychiatric care in prison, but his progress was slow. He remained emotionally distant, showing little remorse. The emotional detachment that once kept him separated from the world now defined his existence behind prison walls. Some believed he would never fully comprehend the weight of what he had done. Others hoped that the guilt, the irreversible finality of his actions, might someday force him to confront his reality. Either way, his future was one of quiet reflection in a world of cement and silence. Far removed from the life he once imagined, Lee's case became a grim symbol not just of the dangers of mental illness left untreated, but of what can happen when deep emotional wounds are allowed to fester unchecked. It was a cautionary tale and a call for change, especially in a society like South Korea, where cultural norms and traditional values often silence discussions about emotional well-being. Chen Ye's death was more than a tragedy, it was a devastating reminder of how quickly a promising life can be stolen by someone lost in their own pain to those who loved her. She was not just a victim, she was vibrant, intelligent, and full of love. Her parents continued to mourn the daughter they had raised with so much hope. Her friends carried the memory of her laughter, her drive, and her kindness. She had once dreamed of shaping the world and, even in death, her story had begun to do just that. They chose to remember her, not for how she died, but for how she lived, and they hoped perhaps more than anything that her story would encourage others to seek help, speak up, and listen before another promising future is stolen in silence. Story 02. Dylan Roof and the Charleston Church Massacre. The date was June 17, 2015, a warm summer evening in Charleston, South Carolina, inside the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, the oldest black congregation in the South. A weekly Bible study was underway. It was a place of peace, of healing, and of history, a sanctuary that had endured generations of racial injustice. But that night, its sacred walls would become the site of one of the most cold-blooded acts of racial violence in modern American history. At just 21 years old, Dylan Roof walked into the church. He looked out of place, pale, with a bowl-cut hairstyle and an emotionless expression, but no one turned him away for over an hour. He sat quietly among the parishioners as they studied scripture, welcomed him, and offered him fellowship. They did not know that the young man in their midst was harboring a hateful mission. At precisely 9:05 p.m., Roof stood up without warning. He pulled out a .45 caliber Glock pistol and began firing. What followed was horrifying. People were killed, shot in cold blood. Among them was Reverend Clementa Pinckney, the church's pastor, and a respected South Carolina state senator. Chaos erupted. Some dove for cover, others held hands, prayed, or shielded loved ones. One woman survived by playing dead, another was intentionally spared so she could, in Roof's own chilling words, tell the world what happened. You're taking over our country, he shouted before reloading and continuing the massacre. Within minutes, a place of worship had been transformed into a scene of terror. Roof fled the church, vanishing into the night, leaving behind broken bodies, shattered faith, and a city in mourning and intense manhunt was launched. By the next morning, police arrested him over 240 miles away in Shelby, North Carolina, after a tip from a concerned citizen. But what authorities uncovered next was even more disturbing. Roof had meticulously planned the attack. This was not a sudden act of violence, it was a calculated massacre rooted in extremist ideology. Investigators found photos of him posing with Confederate flags and white supremacist symbols. He had written a 2,000-word racist manifesto, which he posted online, stating his intention to spark a race war. He had chosen the Emmanuel AIM Church for a reason. Founded in 1816, it was a powerful symbol of black resistance, where civil rights leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had once spoken. Roof had studied its schedule, waited for the Bible study session, and struck when he knew the congregation would be most vulnerable to him. It was more than murder, it was a statement, but instead of inciting chaos and division, his actions galvanized a grieving nation. Vigils were held, tears were shed, and once again, Americans were forced to confront the deep, unhealed wounds of racism and violence in their communities. As the investigation continued, Roof's online trail revealed months of radicalization. He had devoured white supremacist content, researched past mass shootings, and immersed himself in hate-fueled rhetoric. His manifesto claimed that black people were invading white America, and that someone needed to take action. He made himself that someone, and the result was nothing short of a modern-day act of domestic terrorism, as law enforcement pieced together Dylan Roof's movements. They made a chilling discovery. The weapon he used, .45 caliber Glock handgun, had been legally purchased just 2 months prior to the massacre, despite Roof's prior criminal record. A background check should have flagged him and prevented the sale, but due to a clerical error, the transaction went through. This revelation triggered national outrage and reignited heated debates over gun control laws and the systemic failures that allow dangerous individuals to obtain firearms. In the days after the massacre, Charleston was overwhelmed with grief and disbelief. Outside the Emmanuel AIM Church, an impromptu memorial began to grow. Flowers, candles, handwritten notes, and prayers left by mourners from all walks of life. The names of the 9 victims were spoken with reverence: Reverend Clementa Pinckney, Cynthia Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lance, Dupain Middleton, Dr. Tywansa Sanders, Daniel Simmons, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, and Mira Thompson. 9 innocent lives, taken in an act of hate. But amid the sorrow, something extraordinary happened. Just days after the shooting, the families of the victims stood in court during Roof's bond hearing and addressed him directly. What the world expected was rage. What they witnessed instead was forgiveness. "You took something very precious from me," said Nadine Collier, daughter of Ethel Lance, "but I forgive you." It was a moment that stunned the nation. To some, it was unfathomable grace. To others, a powerful act of resistance, proof that Roof had failed to tear the community apart. Instead of igniting division, the attack inspired unity and defiance in the face of hatred. The conversation didn't end with grief and forgiveness. The massacre ignited a nationwide reckoning on race and the symbols that perpetuated, particularly the Confederate flag, which Roof had proudly posed with in photos for decades. Efforts to remove the flag from South Carolina's State House grounds had been blocked by lawmakers who argued it was a symbol of Southern heritage. But in the wake of the Charleston tragedy, that argument collapsed under the weight of public outcry. On July 10, 2015, less than a month after the massacre, the Confederate flag was finally taken down from the Capitol grounds. Thousands gathered to witness the historic moment. For some, it was a step toward healing. For others, it was a purely symbolic act that did little to address the deeper systems of racism that had allowed Roof's ideology to fester. Meanwhile, Roof remained in federal custody, showing no remorse. Investigators said he calmly admitted to the killings during interrogations and expressed no regret, stating he would do it again if given the chance. His chilling indifference solidified the image of a man driven by hatred, completely detached from the human cost of his actions. Federal prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty, a rare move for federal crimes. They argued that Roof's premeditated attack on worshippers during Bible study, motivated by racist ideology, was among the most heinous acts of domestic terrorism in U.S. history. Roof's defense team tried to negotiate a plea deal that would spare him from execution in exchange for life in prison, but he refused, insisting on representing himself. Roof rejected all counsel, a decision that baffled legal experts. Some believed it was arrogance, others saw it as an attempt to control the courtroom and push his ideology. One last time, by November 2016, over a year after the shooting, jury selection began. Hundreds of candidates were screened as the court sought individuals who could fairly weigh the case, despite its emotional weight. The trial officially began on December 7th. Survivors took the stand and described, in painful detail, the horrors of that night. Felicia Sanders recalled hiding under a table with her granddaughter, whispering to her to stay quiet as Roof executed their friends and loved ones. He was cold, calculated. He wanted to make sure there were no survivors, she testified. Roof sat through the proceedings emotionless. He refused to cross-examine witnesses, called no one to the stand in his defense, and made only a single disturbing statement to the jury: "I still feel like I had to do it." The prosecution presented his writings as evidence, including a racist manifesto in which he claimed black people were inferior and that violence was the only way to preserve white dominance. Photos of Roof proudly posing with the Confederate flag were shown, alongside digital records that proved he had planned the attack meticulously over several months in less than 2 hours. The jury reached its verdict: guilty on all 33 federal charges. including hate crimes and obstruction of religious freedom. The sentencing phase. The victims' families returned to the stand. They didn't speak of revenge, but of birthdays missed, holidays forever changed, and the everyday moments stolen from them still. Many of them chose once again to offer forgiveness, a decision that confounded some observers, but reflected the teachings of their church and the depth of their faith. As defense tried to argue, he was mentally ill and had been radicalized online while living in isolation, but the jury was unconvinced. Roof himself dismissed any claim of mental illness, stating plainly, "There's nothing wrong with me psychologically." On January 10, 2017, Dylann Roof was sentenced to death, becoming the first person in U.S. history to receive the federal death penalty for a hate crime. Even as the sentence was read, he showed no emotion. His conviction was seen as justice, but it could never restore what had been lost. The Charleston community continued to grieve, holding vigils and services to honor the victims despite its scars. Emmanuel AIM Church remained open, its congregation more determined than ever to stand against hate. In the years since, Roof's case has become a symbol of the dangers of unchecked extremism. It forced a national reckoning on gun laws, the rise of white supremacist ideology, and the persistent shadow of racism in American life. The Confederate flag was lowered, but the deeper wounds remained still. Charleston's response: grief met with grace, pain met with purpose, offered a powerful message that even in the face of unspeakable hate, love and forgiveness can endure. Story 3. The Paris attacks. November 13, 2015. On the evening of November 13, 2015, Paris pulsed with its usual energy. Cafes were filled with laughter and conversation. Music floated through the streets, and the Stade de France buzzed with excitement as France hosted Germany in a friendly soccer match. Unbeknownst to the thousands enjoying their Friday night, a meticulously coordinated terrorist attack was about to unfold, one that would plunge the city into chaos and leave an indelible scar on the national psyche. Approximately 9:20 p.m., the first sign of terror emerged. A suicide bomber detonated his vest near Gate D of the Stade de France in Saint Denis, a northern suburb of Paris. The blast sent shockwaves through the stadium. Spectators and security personnel were momentarily confused, though shaken. The match continued, still unaware of the growing horror outside. Just 5 minutes later, at 9:25 p.m., gunmen began firing on the packed terraces of Le Caroline, a popular café in Paris' 10th arrondissement. After that, they crossed the street and opened fire on Le Petit Cambodge, a nearby Cambodian restaurant. They shot indiscriminately, leaving a trail of devastation as emergency services rushed to respond. Reports of other shootings and explosions began to surface, making it clear that this was a citywide assault. By 9:30 p.m., a second suicide bomber detonated near the Stade de France, intensifying panic among those inside and around the venue. President Francois Hollande, who was attending the match, was swiftly evacuated. Authorities chose to let the game continue, hoping to avoid mass hysteria. But word of the attacks began circulating among the stunned crowd. At 9:32 p.m., more gunfire erupted. Gunmen targeted Le Bon Beer Café and La Casa Nostra Pizzeria in the 11th arrondissement, again firing on unsuspecting diners and passers-by. Minutes later, they attacked La Belle Equipe, a café on Rue de Charonne, unleashing yet another storm of bullets. Witnesses recalled the attackers' cold precision. They arrived in black vehicles, heavily armed with AK-47s, and showed no mercy. But the most harrowing act of the night began at 9:40 p.m. inside the Bataclan Theater, where the American rock band Eagles of Death Metal was performing to a sold-out audience of approximately 1,500 people. 3 attackers stormed the venue, opened fire, and quickly took hostages. At first, concertgoers thought it was part of the show, but as bodies fell and blood spread, the terrifying reality set in. Armed with assault rifles and suicide vests, the attackers forced survivors toward the stage, using them as human shields. Screams echoed through the building. Outside, A third explosion occurred near the Stade de France at 9:53 p.m. The last of the coordinated blasts. By then, it was clear this was a highly organized, multi-target attack designed to maximize fear and chaos. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Hospitals activated mass casualty protocols, the streets of Paris filled with sirens and flashing lights. Inside the Bataclan, the situation was nightmarish. The terrorists chanted extremist slogans, condemned France's military operations in Syria and Iraq, and executed hostages methodically. Some concert-goers played dead, others fled through emergency exits or climbed onto ledges to escape. Survivors would later describe the attackers as calm and calculated, seemingly devoid of emotion. At 12:20 a.m., after nearly 3 hours of horror, French special forces launched an assault on the Bataclan. Elite tactical units stormed the theater. 2 of the attackers detonated their vests. As police advanced, the third was shot before he could trigger his device. The operation ended the siege and freed the remaining hostages, but the damage was catastrophic. 90 people were killed inside the Bataclan, making it the deadliest of the night's attacks in total. The November 13th attacks claimed 130 lives and injured more than 350 people, marking one of France's darkest days since World War I. The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant ISIL claimed responsibility, stating the attacks were retaliation for French airstrikes on ISIL targets in the Middle East. The attackers were identified as French and Belgian nationals, many of whom had traveled to Syria and returned to Europe undetected, exploiting the refugee crisis and gaps in continental security in the aftermath. France declared a nationwide state of emergency. Borders were reinforced, thousands of officers deployed, and intelligence operations ramped up within hours. French warplanes struck ISIL strongholds in Syria. The country had been jolted into a wartime posture. Investigators swiftly pieced together the origins of the plot. The attackers had planned their operation in Belgium and used encrypted apps to coordinate their movements. One of the key figures was Abdelhamid, a Belgian extremist and suspected ringleader. Surveillance placed him in Paris during the attacks. Intelligence linked him to Syria, where he had received training and battle experience with ISIL. Violence shook France to its core, but the response was resolute. In the days that followed, makeshift memorials appeared outside attack sites. The Bataclan, once a symbol of joy, became a shrine of grief. Survivors gave emotional testimonies, families mourned in public vigils, and all across the world, global landmarks lit up in the colors of the French flag. For many Parisians, the trauma was deep, but so was the defiance amid the grief. A powerful message emerged that liberty, unity, and human spirit would not be broken by hate. Paris attacks, the night that changed Europe. Despite being one of Europe's most wanted terrorists, Abdelhamid Abode had managed to evade capture. His ability to coordinate such a devastating assault in the heart of the European Union raised urgent questions about the effectiveness of international counterterrorism efforts. Just days after the attacks, the search for surviving accomplices intensified. On November 18, 2015, French police launched a major raid in the Paris suburb of Saint-Denis, acting on intelligence that Abode and several suspects were hiding in an apartment. Heavily armed officers stormed the building in the early hours. What followed was a fierce gun battle that lasted nearly 7 hours. During the standoff, a female suicide bomber, later identified as Abode's cousin, detonated her explosive vest as police closed in, killing herself instantly. Abode himself was shot and killed in the exchange. His body was barely recognizable, torn apart by the intensity of the gunfire and explosions. Even with Abode dead, the manhunt was far from over. One fugitive in particular stood out: Salah Abdeslam, the only surviving member of the cell that carried out the attacks. Unlike his fellow attackers, Abdeslam fled Paris after the massacre, managing to avoid capture for months despite being the subject of an international manhunt. His run ended in March 2016, when Belgian authorities arrested him during a dramatic raid. In Brussels, his capture was a crucial breakthrough, offering investigators insight into the logistics, planning, and scope of the operation. In the aftermath, Europe was forced to confront a grim reality. Terrorism had evolved. Paris attacks exposed glaring vulnerabilities in how European nations shared intelligence. Many of the perpetrators were already known to security agencies, yet they had moved freely between countries, often under false identities or with forged documents. Several had even traveled to Syria and back without raising alarms. Attacks also ignited fierce debates over immigration and border control. Some politicians pointed to reports that one attacker had entered Europe posing as a Syrian refugee, arguing that the influx of migrants from war-torn regions posed a threat. Others pushed back, warning that ISIL deliberately sought to weaponize the refugee crisis. Exploiting fear and mistrust to sow division, they emphasized that the overwhelming majority of refugees were themselves victims of terrorism, not its perpetrators. Politics. The emotional toll on Paris was immense. The city, long a symbol of resilience and romance, was shaken. Parisians reported a lasting sense of fear, avoiding public places and large gatherings. Armed soldiers now patrolled the streets, a daily reminder that the threat had not disappeared yet. Amid the grief, there were powerful moments of unity. Candlelight vigils lit up plazas across France. Crowds gathered at Place de la République, leaving flowers, letters, and messages of love and solidarity. The phrase "Je suis Paris" spread across social media, echoing the global outpouring of support that had followed the Charlie Hebdo massacre earlier that year outside the Bataclan Theater, where 90 people had lost their lives. One survivor left a handwritten sign: "They wanted us to be afraid. Instead, we will sing louder." And indeed, they did. In the weeks that followed, Parisians returned to cafes and concert halls. Life resumed quietly. Defiant, the people of Paris refused to let fear define them. The investigation stretched on 4 years, uncovering sprawling terrorist networks across Europe. Numerous individuals were arrested for providing logistical support, whether by supplying weapons, safe houses, or travel assistance. These efforts, combined with intensified operations, dealt a significant blow to ISIL's ability to organize large-scale attacks in the West. Still, the scars ran deep for the families of the 130 victims. No amount of justice could undo the loss. Trials would unfold over the years in both France and Belgium, but the courtroom could only offer limited closure. The November 13th attacks became a turning point, a sobering reminder of how fragile security can be, how radicalization can flourish in the shadows, and how determined communities must be to resist terror without losing their values. In the months and years that followed, France and Europe transformed. French authorities expanded their intelligence capabilities, increased funding for and passed sweeping new security laws. A state of emergency, declared by President Francois Hollande, remained in effect until 2017. Thousands of raids, searches, and arrests followed, aimed at dismantling extremist cells. One of the most troubling revelations was how easily the attackers had exploited weaknesses in Europe's border systems. Some had traveled back and forth between Syria and Europe under false names or with fake documents. Others had been flagged by intelligence services, but limited resources meant they weren't actively monitored. The Schengen Agreement, which allowed passport-free travel across most of Europe, came under intense scrutiny. Some countries temporarily reinstated border checks, but many experts warned that physical borders were only part of the problem. The deeper crisis lay within. Most of the attackers were not foreign operatives. They were European citizens born and raised in places like Paris and Brussels. Many had grown up in marginalized neighborhoods marked by unemployment, discrimination, and social isolation. These communities had become fertile ground for extremist recruiters. In response, governments launched de-radicalization programs, working with religious leaders, teachers, and community organizers to intervene early and prevent young people from falling into extremist ideology. Meanwhile, another challenge loomed: radicalization. In prisons, extremist inmates were recruiting behind bars, spreading their ideology unchecked. To counter this, France reformed its prison system, isolating high-risk individuals, but the threat persisted, and concerns mounted over what might happen when these inmates were eventually released. The trials moved forward. Salah Abdeslam, the sole surviving attacker, was extradited to France. Hopes were high that he would provide key information, but in court, Abdeslam was largely uncooperative, offering little remorse and refusing to answer many questions. Other accomplices were also tried. Some had supplied weapons. Others had offered shelter or transport. In 2022, after a marathon trial that lasted nearly 10 months, Salah Abdeslam was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, one of the harshest sentences in French legal history. But for the victims' families, no sentence could truly restore what was lost. The November 13, 2015 attacks left more than just physical damage. They reshaped European counter-terrorism strategy, exposed the depth of radicalization within society, and altered the way cities like Paris saw themselves and their future. The city of lights had been darkened but not extinguished. What emerged was a people more united, more cautious, but also more determined than ever, not to let hate dictate their way of life. Story 3. The Paris attacks. A nation scarred, a spirit unbroken in France. For the families of the victims, the legal proceedings brought a sense of justice, but no verdict could ever undo the pain of their loss. Survivors of the November 13, 2015 Paris attacks were left deeply traumatized, many battling post-traumatic stress disorder and haunted by the unspeakable events of that night. The psychological toll extended far beyond those directly impacted across France. Fear of terrorism crept into everyday life, changing the national psyche. Heavily armed soldiers became a routine presence at tourist hotspots, schools, and public events, an enduring reminder of the country's vulnerability. Yet, despite the scars, the people of Paris refused to be defined by fear. In the years that followed, the city embarked on a journey of healing. Memorials were erected at each attack site, including a somber plaque outside the Bataclan Theater, where mourners still leave flowers and handwritten notes. Annual remembrance ceremonies were instituted, and moments of silence echoed across the nations. Solemn tributes to lives senselessly lost. The attacks also left a deep imprint on France's political landscape. Nationalist and anti-immigration rhetoric gained momentum in the aftermath. Far-right leaders called for stricter border controls and harsher measures against radical Islam. Public debates around religious expression, particularly the role of Islam in secular French society, grew increasingly divisive. But even as these tensions rose, France clung to its founding principles: liberty, equality, fraternity. The government responded with not just enhanced security, but with community-building efforts, initiatives promoting interfaith dialogue, cultural integration, and programs aimed at eradicating. The Paris attacks revealed the expanding threat posed by ISIS and its ability to inspire violence far beyond the Middle East. In response, France intensified its military campaign, joining US-led coalition airstrikes in Syria and Iraq. These operations, coupled with regional offensives, eventually led to the fall of ISIS' so-called caliphate by 2019. But the defeat of ISIS' territorial stronghold did not mean the end of its ideology. Intelligence agencies warned of a tactical shift toward lone wolf attacks and decentralized radicalization. The internet had become the new battleground, with extremist propaganda flourishing across social media, demanding new approaches to counterterrorism. Looking back, the events of that November night became a defining chapter in modern French history, a chilling reminder of the threats facing open societies, but also a powerful testament to resilience. The attackers sought to divide, to instill terror and hatred. Instead, they fortified the will of the people. Today, Paris stands tall, not in denial of its pain, but in defiance of it. The victims are not only remembered in stone memorials, but in the everyday courage of Parisians who choose to live freely, refusing to let terror dictate their story. Story 4. The murder of Kevin Murray. Justice silenced in the early hours of September 4, 2015. A calculated and ruthless crime unfolded in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. At the center of this chilling case was Dr. Kunaporn Sip, a respected military pathologist, known for handling some of the country's most sensitive forensic cases, but behind his polished reputation lay a man desperate to cover up the corruption that threatened to destroy him. The man pursuing him was Deputy Public Prosecutor Anthony Kevin Morai, an incorruptible force in Malaysia's legal system. Morai had spent years working with the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, fearlessly taking on powerful figures and exposing deep-rooted misconduct. His latest case threatened to uncover malpractice within both the medical and judicial systems. With Dr. Kunaporn squarely in his sights for months, tension simmered. Dr. Kunaporn knew that if the prosecution moved forward, it would spell the end of his career, his wealth, and possibly his freedom, so he made a horrifying decision. Kevin Morai had to be eliminated on the morning of September 4th. Morai left his home in his government-issued Proton Perdana as he drove toward his office in Putrajaya. He was unknowingly being followed a convoy of vehicles hired assassins. Acting on Kunaporn's orders, trailed him with precision near a quieter stretch of road. They struck one vehicle, rammed into Morai's car, forcing him to stop. The men swarmed, dragged him out, and forced him into another vehicle. He was overpowered, restrained, and driven to a remote location for days. Morai's disappearance baffled authorities, but soon, the investigation pointed toward foul play, surveillance footage, and phone records unraveled a conspiracy that implicated a group of criminals hired by Dr. Kunaporn. Known by one, the killers were tracked down under pressure. They began to confess. What they revealed horrified the nation. Morai had been taken to a secluded location and murdered. His body was placed in a steel drum, which was then filled with some grotesque attempt to erase all evidence. The drum was dumped into a swamp near Sabang, Jaya, guided by one of the suspects. Investigators discovered the barrel, partially submerged in mud and water. Forensic teams worked tirelessly, chipping away at the concrete until they confirmed what everyone feared. The remains inside belonged to Kevin Morai. The murder was no random act of violence. It was a deliberate, methodical execution, an attempt to silence a man who had made it his life's mission to speak truth to power. The arrest of Dr. Kunaporn sent shockwaves across the country. A trusted medical professional, once at the heart of the justice system, had orchestrated a murder to protect himself from exposure. The legal proceedings that followed became one of Malaysia's most closely watched trials. As the horrifying details emerged, the public grappled with the realization that corruption in the system had reached fatal depths. Yet, Kevin Morai's legacy endured. His death became a rallying cry against corruption, a symbol of integrity in a system that too often protected the powerful. Though silenced, his voice echoed louder in death than in life, urging Malaysia not to look away in the face of darkness. Kevin Morai stood unflinching in honoring him. So must Wichi. Murder of Kevin Morai. A nation's Arisiko Anayanjitha. Discovery of Kevin Morai's remains shocked the entire nation. His body, encased in cement for days inside a steel drum, was nearly unrecognizable. Forensic specialists faced immense challenges, but after painstaking efforts, they were able to retrieve DNA samples. Following extensive analysis, their worst fears were confirmed. The remains belonged to Kevin Morai. Of the confirmation sent a wave of grief and outrage across Malaysia. Morai's murder wasn't just a tragedy for his family. It symbolized the peril faced by those who dared to confront corruption. A respected prosecutor, Kevin Morai had made powerful enemies, and now he had paid the ultimate price with his body found. The investigation shifted rapidly toward bringing the perpetrators to justice, one by one. The hired assassins confessed in harrowing detail. They revealed how they had been approached, contracted, and paid to eliminate Morai. Investigators learned the crime was not a spur of a moment decision. It had been meticulously planned for weeks. At the center of the plot was Dr. Kunan Safesweran, once a revered figure in both the medical and legal communities, but beneath the surface, he had become a desperate man, cornered by a corruption investigation led by Murray himself. The charges were severe: falsifying medical reports, bribery, and abuse of power, crimes that, if proven, would have ended his career and possibly his freedom for months. Dr. Coonan had tried to manipulate the system, leveraging his influence to escape accountability, but Morey was unyielding. Known for his incorruptibility, he refused to back down in the face of bribes or threats in Coonan's eyes. Morey had become an immovable obstacle, and eliminating him was the only way out. The plan was elaborate. Some of the hired men surveilled Morey's daily routine. Noting his patterns, others were tasked with ambushing him on the road once abducted. Morey was tortured before being killed. His body was then sealed in cement inside a steel drum. A gruesome attempt to destroy evidence, but the killers made mistakes. Surveillance footage captured Morey's vehicle being followed on the day of his disappearance. Witnesses later reported seeing a struggle near where his car was abandoned. Phone records traced back to the suspects revealed a web of calls between Dr. Coonan and his men, both before and after the murder. These digital breadcrumbs proved invaluable, painting a damning picture for investigators and eventually prosecutors. The public was outraged. Morey's murder wasn't viewed as just an individual crime. It was seen as an assault on Malaysia's justice system. Candlelight vigils were held across the country. Thousands mourned the loss of a man who had become a symbol of integrity and courage. His colleagues remembered his tireless dedication, and his family, shattered by grief, demanded justice behind bars. Dr. Coonan was beginning to understand the enormity of his mistake. The arrogance that once led him to believe he could orchestrate the perfect crime was now replaced by fear. The very justice system he had tried to manipulate was closing in, and this time, it was he who would stand trial. That trial, which began in late 2016, became one of the most high-profile in Malaysian history. The courtroom overflowed with journalists, legal observers, and citizens eager to witness the proceedings. This wasn't just about one man's guilt. It was about the credibility of the Malaysian legal system itself. The prosecution, led by one of Morey's former colleagues, presented a chilling and methodical case. They detailed how Dr. Coonan had plotted the murder, driven by fear and a cold instinct for self-preservation. Evidence included surveillance footage, mobile phone data, and damning confessions from the hired assassins, each piece corroborating the other with startling consistency. Defense tried to paint a different picture. They argued Dr. Coonan was a victim of circumstance, a man pushed to desperation, even possibly framed. They questioned the validity of the confessions, hinting at coercion, and labeled the evidence as circumstantial. But to many observers, the defense's arguments felt hollow in the face of the mountain of evidence against their client. The most emotional moment came when Kevin's family testified. His brother, Richard Morey, gave a moving statement about Kevin's integrity, his unshakable commitment to justice, and the devastating void his loss had created. His words deeply resonated with the jury and the nation throughout the trial. Dr. Coonan maintained a cold, controlled demeanor, but those who knew him well noticed the cracks, the flickers of fear in his eyes, the tightness in his posture, the subtle panic of a man losing control after weeks of proceedings. The trial reached its climax. The jury deliberated for several days. On February 22, 2017, the verdict was delivered. Dr. Coonan Saveswaran was found guilty of the murder of Kevin Morey. He was sentenced to death by hanging. His co-conspirators, the hired killers, received varying sentences, depending on their level of involvement. Verdict sent shockwaves through both the legal and medical communities. Rarely had someone of Dr. Coonan's stature been brought to justice so decisively. His conviction marked a historic moment, a signal that no one, regardless of power or influence, was above the law. Yet the trial also exposed deep, systemic flaws, the reach of corruption, and the peril faced by those who challenge it. Kevin Morey's death became a national reckoning. It sparked public debate about whistleblower protection, legal reform, and accountability. Though justice was served, it came at a devastating cost. Kevin Moray's murder reminded Malaysia and the world that the fight against corruption is often dangerous, and the cost of truth can be tragically high, but it also reaffirmed the value of courage and the enduring power of one man's integrity to shake a system and inspire change of the TRAL. Aftermath of the trial marked a turning point in Malaysia's battle against corruption, while the conviction of Dr. Kunran brought some measure of closure to Kevin Moray's grieving family and the concerned public. It also ignited a much larger conversation. There was now a nationwide call for increased transparency, stronger protections for whistleblowers, and more robust systems to root out corruption at every level of government and society. In the years that followed, Malaysia experienced a wave of reform. Public institutions began to prioritize accountability, and the case of Kevin Moray became a rallying cry for those fighting for a more just and transparent nation, one where the law would protect the innocent, regardless of status or power. To his family, friends, and colleagues, Kevin Moray would never be forgotten. He was remembered not just as a public servant, but as a man who sacrificed everything in the pursuit of justice. Though his death was deeply tragic, it was not in vain. It sparked change and inspired a movement. His legacy lived on in the fight for a better, more honest Malaysia. 2 RY5. The murder of Cettan, 2015. A chilling crime shocked the bustling city of Fuzhou, Fujian Province, China. At the center of it was a young man named Wu. Born on November 6, 1992, coming from a middle-class family, Wu was a student at Peking University, one of China's most prestigious institutions. On the surface, he seemed like a model student with a bright future, but behind his academic success was a dark and festering resentment. Wu had always had a strained relationship with his mother, Cet. She was a driven woman who had devoted her life to giving her son the best possible opportunities. She worked tirelessly to ensure he reached the highest levels of academic excellence, but her devotion came at a cost. Wu felt suffocated by her relentless expectations and what he saw as constant interference in his life. Though in his early 20s and attending an elite university, Wu felt emotionally imprisoned. No matter how well he performed, it was never enough. Her high standards loomed over him, leaving him bitter, isolated, and increasingly angry. Over time, Wu's frustration morphed into something far more sinister in his mind. His mother was the barrier standing between him and a life of freedom. Eventually, a horrifying thought took root. If she were no longer alive, he could finally live on his own terms. This wasn't an impulsive act. Wu spent months meticulously planning his mother's murder. He studied how he might conceal the crime and deceive those around him. On July 10, 2015, he lured his mother to his residence in Fuzhou. Under the pretense of discussing his future, he told her he wanted to have a serious talk about his life in education. A believable scenario for the ever-concerned Tian'an. When she arrived, he engaged her in conversation, pretending to open up about his plans after graduation. But beneath the surface, Wu had already decided what he was going to do. Without warning, he struck her multiple times with a dumbbell bar. The brutal assault caused fatal injuries, and Cet Hunan's life came to a violent end. Cold and detached, Wu showed no emotion as he set about concealing the crime. He wrapped his mother's body in layers of plastic and activated carbon to mask the odor of decomposition, leaving the remains hidden in his dormitory. His plan was chillingly methodical. To prevent suspicion, Wu fabricated an elaborate story. He told friends and family that his mother had traveled abroad with him to support his continued studies. He even went as far as sending fake emails and making phone calls, impersonating his mother to reassure relatives that she was safe and doing well. Meanwhile, he accessed her bank accounts and used the stolen money to fund a lavish lifestyle, indulging in expensive goods and finally living without the control he had once despised. But as months passed, the deception began to unravel. Tian'an's relatives grew increasingly worried after losing contact with her. Their concern eventually led to a police investigation. As investigators followed the trail, suspicion began to focus on Wu. his story started to fall apart, and eventually, the gruesome truth was exposed. The investigation into Cit Annan's disappearance revealed the full extent of Wu's deception and brutality. What had initially seemed like a mysterious disappearance turned into one of the most disturbing homicide cases in recent Chinese memory. The public reaction was one of disbelief and revulsion. A promising young student once held up as a symbol of achievement was now seen as a cold-blooded killer, willing to commit unthinkable violence just to escape his mother's influence. As the case unfolded in the years that followed, Wu's twisted motivations came to light, but for many, the murder of Cit Tian'an was an enduring reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked resentment, emotional pressure, and a warped desire for freedom at any cost. NGR and deception. The murder of Zhang Xiaochina, mystery surrounding Zheng Qin's sudden disappearance, took a disturbing turn when her relatives began to grow suspicious. Wu, her only son, had insisted that she had gone abroad, but the story didn't sit right. There were no travel records, no goodbye calls, and no physical evidence that she had left the country, despite his repeated reassurances. Wu's explanations were inconsistent, and his behavior increasingly erratic in a desperate effort to keep the lie alive. Wu went to chilling lengths. He sent out fake emails and made phone calls pretending to be his mother. Even her social media accounts remained active, used by Wu to post fabricated updates, all meant to convince family and friends that Zheng Qin was simply living her life elsewhere. But eventually, the cracks began to show. By February 2016, Zheng Qin's extended family could no longer ignore the strange silence. She had always been close to them, and the lack of direct contact was deeply troubling. After failing to reach her, despite repeated attempts, they contacted the police, officially filing a missing person report. Investigators immediately took the matter seriously as they dug into Wu's recent activities. Suspicion quickly shifted toward him. Financial records revealed that Wu had been withdrawing large sums of money from his mother's bank accounts since her alleged departure, and while he was still officially a student, he had been living lavishly, far beyond what his status and income should have allowed. This financial discrepancy raised serious red flags as detectives expanded the investigation. They began interviewing Wu's classmates and acquaintances. Many spoke of his withdrawn and distant demeanor in the months leading up to his mother's disappearance. Some said he was eerily calm, even when questioned about her whereabouts. Eventually, the police obtained a warrant to search Wu's residence. What they uncovered inside his dorm room would shock the entire nation. Hidden beneath layers of plastic and fabric designed to mask the stench, police found the decomposing remains of Zheng Qin. She had been wrapped carefully, almost methodically, to delay discovery. Forensic analysis later confirmed the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head, likely from a heavy object, such as a dumbbell. The truth was horrifying. Wu had murdered his own mother, and then lived alongside the secret for months, slying, stealing, and maintaining an elaborate web of deception. His arrest came on April 20th, 2019, at Chongqing Jiangbei International Airport. Wu had been attempting to flee the country, but authorities apprehended him before he could board an outbound flight. During intense interrogation, Wu finally confessed. He admitted that he had killed his mother out of deep-seated resentment. He described, in chilling detail, how he had struck her during an argument, then carefully concealed her body afterward. He used her identity to forge documents, create fake communication channels, and continue withdrawing money, defrauding both her accounts and relatives. His calculated manipulation left everyone stunned. Wu claimed his motive stemmed from years of emotional pressure. He said his mother had imposed impossible expectations on him, expecting academic perfection, total obedience, and absolute control over his life. According to Wu, he felt suffocated in his twisted rationale. Killing her was the only way to regain autonomy and break free from the life she had dictated for him. The public was shocked. Wu was no dropout or outsider. He was a promising, intelligent student from one of China's top universities. The brutal nature of his crime stood in stark contrast to the image many had of him. His trial began in 2020 and quickly became a national spectacle. The defense argued that Wu had suffered a mental breakdown driven to the edge by years of psychological abuse and unrealistic expectations. They painted him as a young man cracking under emotional pressure. But the prosecution presented a much darker picture, that Wu's actions were premeditated, cold-blooded, and entirely calculated. They pointed to the months of deception, the forged documents, the social media manipulation, and the large-scale financial fraud. This, they argued, was not a temporary lapse. It was a deliberate and remorseless execution of a murder, and cover-up. Court proceedings were tense and emotionally charged for many. The most disturbing element wasn't just the crime itself, but the fact that a seemingly successful, educated individual could commit such an atrocity against his own mother. Ultimately, Wu was found guilty of both murder and fraud. He received the death penalty for the killing of his mother and an additional 18 years in prison for the extensive fraud he had committed. In the aftermath, public reaction was mixed. Some felt justice had been served, others believed that Wu's age and mental state should have been considered, and that a life sentence would have been more appropriate. But one thing was certain: the murder of Sang Chin had touched a nerve. It forced society to confront difficult questions about parental pressure, emotional repression, and the hidden toll of toxic family dynamics. Wu's story became a dark symbol of what can happen when unresolved anger, mental health issues, and deep familial conflict go unaddressed. His name would be forever linked to one of the most disturbing domestic crimes in recent memory. In the end, Sang Chin's death didn't just destroy a family, it exposed a silent epidemic, the emotional strain that can build behind closed doors, unnoticed, until it finally explodes. The defense painted Wu as a young man driven to the brink by years of emotional turmoil and psychological distress. They argued that the immense pressure he endured under his mother's relentless expectations gradually eroded his mental stability, ultimately leading to a complete emotional breakdown that culminated in her tragic murder. While acknowledging the gravity of his actions, the defense urged the court to show leniency, citing Wu's youth and his potential for rehabilitation. They contended that the death penalty was an excessively harsh punishment for someone still in the early stages of adulthood. But the court saw things differently. Despite the defense's plea for mercy, Wu was found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to death for the murder of his mother and received an additional 18 years in prison for the fraud he committed in the aftermath, deceiving relatives, manipulating finances, and weaving an elaborate web of lies to cover up the crime. The court's ruling sent a clear message: no matter how gifted, how intelligent, or how accomplished one may seem, no one is above accountability. While many believed justice had been served, others struggled with the severity of the punishment. They questioned whether it was truly appropriate for someone so young, someone who may have acted under immense psychological strain. The evidence presented in court told a different story. Wu's actions were not spontaneous or the result of a single moment of emotional collapse. They were methodically planned, executed with chilling precision, and followed by calculated deception. This wasn't merely a tragic mistake, it was the culmination of a long brewing resentment that had taken a dark and irreversible turn. After his conviction, Wu was transferred to a detention facility in Fujian province as he awaited the outcome of his appeal. The appeals process stretched on for several years, with Wu's defense team fighting to have the death sentence overturned. They argued he was a victim of his own psychological state, that he hadn't fully understood the consequences of his actions at the time of the murder. But in May 2023, the Fujian Provincial High People's Court rejected his appeal. It upheld the original sentence, stating unequivocally that Wu's actions had been premeditated and carried out with full awareness. There would be no further legal recourse. His fate was sealed. The court scheduled his execution for early the following year. As news of the case spread, it ignited widespread discussion across China. The media coverage was intense, and Wu's story became a focal point for national debates, particularly around the pressures students face in China's fiercely competitive Education system experts, psychologists, and educators weighed in, pointing to the emotional toll of perfectionistic parenting and academic. Overdrive Wu's case became a tragic symbol of the potential consequences of unchecked parental pressure. His mother's high expectations, though perhaps well-intentioned, had contributed to a psychological collapse that would end in bloodshed. The incident sparked a wave of public reflection, with many calling for a fundamental change in how children are raised and supported. Emotional fallout extended far beyond Wu's immediate family. The relatives of his mother, Sang Yin, were left shattered not just by her violent death, but by the betrayal. Wu had convinced them for months that she was alive and well, maintaining a cold, deliberate lie that deepened the wound when the truth finally emerged. Once regarded as a promising young man with a bright future, Wu became a cautionary tale, a reminder that emotional isolation and psychological strain can exist even behind the most polished facades. His descent into violence shocked the nation and forced a reckoning with the darker side of success. Silence and internalized pressure. The case also reignited the ongoing debate about the death penalty in China. Some saw Wu's execution as necessary and just. Others questioned whether death was the right response for a crime committed by someone so young and emotionally unstable. Was it justice, or was it a failure to recognize the mental health crisis that had preceded the murder? On January 31st, 2024, Wu was executed by lethal injection. His death marked the final chapter in a haunting saga that had gripped the public for nearly a decade. The headlines eventually faded, but the legacy remained an urgent reminder of what can happen when emotional needs go unmet, when mental health is neglected, and when open communication within families breaks down. The murder of Sang Yin stood as a devastating testament to the hidden costs of parental pressure and psychological distress, and the irreversible tragedy that can unfold when those forces go unchecked. Story 6 in 2015. A chilling and heartbreaking crime rocked a quiet suburban neighborhood in Melbourne, Australia. What began as a seemingly ordinary domestic struggle would end in one of the city's most tragic and talked about murders of the year. The man at the center of it all was 38-year-old Christopher Michael Edwards, born and raised in Melbourne. Christopher was known as a quiet, somewhat reclusive individual. He worked as a truck driver and lived a modest life to the outside world. He seemed like a private man, one who avoided attention and kept to himself. He had a few close friends, but little about his personal life raised concern. Certainly nothing that hinted at what he would later do, but behind closed doors. Edwards was deeply troubled. His marriage to 33-year-old Tara Edwards was strained and volatile. While their relationship had started with hope and affection, it quickly soured. Tara, a devoted mother to 2 young children, confided in friends and family that she felt overwhelmed and unsafe in the marriage. Christopher had become controlling and emotionally unstable, his behavior growing more possessive over time. He accused her of cheating, of planning to leave him, and he kept her emotionally tethered with manipulation and fear. Despite Tara's efforts to escape, the toxic cycle always seemed to pull her back. On the night of November 26, 2015, the tension reached a horrific climax. Consumed by rage and paranoia, Christopher snapped in a violent outburst inside their home. He attacked Tara. The exact sequence of events remains unclear, but what's known is harrowing. He struck her multiple times with a blunt object, and then strangled her to death after murdering his wife. He attempted to cover his tracks, disposing of her body in a nearby creek, hoping to erase the evidence of what he had done. But the truth would not stay buried for long. The murder of Tara Edwards, a story of deception, domestic violence, and a chilling confession. Christopher Edwards believed that by disposing of his wife Tara's body, he could erase any trace of his crime. In a panic to avoid capture, he began weaving a web of lies, but he made crucial mistakes shortly after the murder. Edwards contacted several friends, telling them he'd had an argument with Tara earlier that evening. At first, the calls raised no red flags, but as the days passed without any word from Tara, One friend grew suspicious. Edwards, meanwhile, continued his charade. He feigned concern, posed as a worried husband, and went about his daily life chatting with neighbors, showing up to work, and maintaining the illusion of normalcy behind closed doors. However, he was hiding a horrific secret. The investigation into Tara's disappearance began several days after she was last seen. Police were initially baffled. There were no clear signs of foul play. Christopher painted their marriage as troubled but unremarkable, adding to the confusion. But Tara's family and close friends weren't convinced. She was a devoted mother of two who would never abandon her children. Their intuition told them something was terribly wrong. Then came the first major breakthrough. Friends told police that Edwards had acted strangely in the days after Tara vanished. He was unusually calm, detached, even casual when talking about her disappearance. His behavior simply didn't align with that of a grieving spouse. Detectives obtained Edwards' phone records and uncovered something damning. He had called Tara's phone multiple times after she had already been killed. This behavior suggested not grief, but manipulation, a calculated effort to make it appear as though he believed she was still alive. Investigators began focusing more closely on his movements and financial activity around the time of her disappearance. Further investigation revealed that Edwards had made suspicious financial transactions, withdrawals, transfers, and unauthorized use of Tara's bank cards. It looked increasingly like he was building an alibi and trying to hide evidence. Yet, despite mounting suspicion, Edwards continued to deny any involvement. That denial began to crumble when forensic teams discovered blood traces in the couple's home, clear evidence of violence. Blood spatter patterns on the floor strongly suggested Tara had been attacked and killed there. There was no longer any doubt. This wasn't a missing person case. It was a homicide. As the case against him strengthened, police received a crucial tip. One of Edwards' friends recalled a conversation in which he casually said Tara had just left him. The tone and content of the remark struck the friend as odd and unsettling. That tip led investigators to revisit a creek just outside Melbourne, an area previously considered irrelevant. This time, forensic experts uncovered pieces of Tara's clothing and traces of blood. Eventually, decomposed remains found nearby were confirmed to be hers. Christopher Edwards had dumped her body in that remote location in a desperate attempt to conceal his crime. Police brought him in for further questioning. Still, he stuck to his story, but under hours of pressure, inconsistencies in his statements became too numerous to ignore. Eventually, Edwards broke in a cold, emotionless confession. He detailed the events of that night. According to Edwards, the murder stemmed from a heated argument about their failing marriage. Overcome with jealousy and rage, he attacked Tara with a blunt object and then strangled her. He admitted to planning the murder in advance and to methodically cleaning up the crime scene. He disposed of her body in the creek, then returned to his life as if nothing had happened, calling friends, acting concerned, pretending to be the devoted husband. The confession stunned friends, neighbors, and co-workers. The man they thought they knew, quiet, unassuming, a father, had committed an act of unthinkable brutality. The case revealed the hidden darkness that can exist behind closed doors. Tara's murder shook the Melbourne community to its core. Tributes poured in for a woman described as vibrant, kind, and full of life, a devoted mother, daughter, and friend. She was deeply loved, and her loss left an irreplaceable void. As the case went to trial, the story took on larger meaning. It sparked national conversations about domestic violence, emotional abuse, and the silent suffering that so many endure behind a veil of normalcy. Christopher Edwards was ultimately exposed, not just as a murderer, but as a manipulator who hid his rage and control behind the mask of a family man. The story of Tara Edwards became a grim reminder. Sometimes, the greatest dangers lie within the home, and sometimes, the most unassuming faces conceal the darkest truths. As the investigation into Tara Edwards' death unfolded, the truth about her marriage became impossible to ignore. The deeper authorities dug, the more apparent it became that Christopher Edwards' anger and need for control had been the driving forces behind her Murder Tara had endured years of emotional and psychological abuse. Her tragic end, the result of Christopher's unchecked jealousy, insecurity, and rage. He never sought help. Instead, he let his emotions consume him, ultimately culminating in a brutal act of violence against the woman he claimed to love. Tara was more than a victim. She was a devoted mother, a cherished daughter, and a loyal friend. Those closest to her knew she had tried desperately to escape the suffocating grip of her abusive relationship. Her death left a deep and permanent scar on her loved ones and the community at large. When Christopher Edwards was arrested and charged with her murder, the shock was profound. Many struggled to reconcile the image of a seemingly quiet, ordinary man with the reality of what he had done. His ability to mask his true nature raised haunting questions. How had no one seen the signs? Could this tragedy have been prevented? For Tara's children, the loss was beyond comprehension. They were left without the love and presence of their mother, a void that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Cut to trial coverage. Christopher Edwards' trial drew significant attention. The courtroom was tense, packed with family members, friends, and community members who had come seeking answers and justice. The prosecution presented a chilling, methodical account of the murder. They outlined how Edwards had planned the killing, concealed his actions, and attempted to mislead others with lies and staged concern. Blood evidence found throughout the home, suspicious financial transactions, and fabricated phone calls painted a clear portrait of a man desperately trying to cover his tracks. In contrast, the defense argued that Edwards was a man under severe emotional duress, someone who had snapped after years of internal turmoil and marital strain. They portrayed him as remorseful and mentally compromised at the time of the killing. His quiet demeanor in court, however, did little to support that claim. Witnesses noted how distant, even cold, he appeared, his expression unreadable, eyes cast down, as though he were detached from the horror of what had occurred. Then came the testimonies from Tara's loved ones, powerful, painful reminders of the woman they had lost. Her mother recalled the last conversation they shared, in which Tara confided about the toxic, controlling nature of her marriage and her failed attempts to leave. She spoke of trying to help her daughter break free, but Tara had felt trapped, caught in a cycle of manipulation and fear. The courtroom wept with her. Tara's children were too young to testify, but their presence lingered throughout the proceedings. Every parent in the room imagined what they had lost: a mother's love, her guidance, her protection. On the other side of the courtroom, Edward's own family and friends sat in disbelief. Many said they had never witnessed signs of violence or cruelty, but the evidence spoke louder. The prosecution argued that beneath his quiet exterior, Edwards had long harbored deep resentment and possessiveness. They said he could not stand the thought of losing control over Tara, and when she tried to leave, he responded in the most extreme and irreversible way possible. As the trial came to a close, the jury faced a difficult decision. Was this a crime of passion or premeditated murder? The prosecution maintained it was calculated. Every action after the murder, from the staged phone calls to the financial cover-ups, pointed to intent and manipulation. The defense asked for leniency, requesting a verdict of manslaughter due to emotional disturbance. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. Christopher Edwards was found guilty of the murder of his wife, Tara Edwards. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge spoke candidly about the brutality of the crime and the importance of accountability. He acknowledged the profound loss suffered by Tara's family and issued a firm warning: domestic violence would not be excused or overlooked. Closing narration. For Tara's family, the verdict offered some solace, but not healing. The pain of her absence remains. They had fought for justice and received it, but the hole she left in their lives cannot be filled. Her story now stands as a sobering reminder. Emotional abuse is real, control is violence, and behind too many closed doors, tragedies like this are waiting to happen. Tara Edwards' legacy lives on, in the memories of her children, in the voices of her loved ones, and in the call for greater awareness of the dangers hidden within abusive relationships the whole left. In Their Lives by Tara Edwards' absence would never be filled. Her children, now forced to grow up without their mother, faced the unimaginable task of navigating a world stripped of the love, warmth, and protection she once provided. Tara's story is a stark and tragic reminder of the dangers of domestic abuse, of the horrors that can hide behind closed doors, and of the devastating consequences when anger and violence are left unchecked. Transition to next story. Title card. Story 7. A Year of Shock. Europe in 2015. In 2015, Europe was rocked by a series of high-profile criminal events that sent shockwaves across the continent. These incidents not only stunned the public, but also spurred sweeping changes in national security policies, counter-terrorism strategies, and international cooperation. Segment. Paris terror attacks, November 13, 2015. One of the most devastating tragedies occurred on the night of November 13th, when Paris became the target of a series of coordinated terrorist attacks orchestrated by the Islamic State, or ISIS. The attackers, armed with automatic weapons and explosives, struck multiple locations across the city with chilling precision, including the Bataclan Concert Hall, the Stade de France Stadium, and several busy cafes and restaurants. By the end of the night, 130 people were dead, and hundreds more wounded. The siege at the Bataclan was especially harrowing as a rock band performed inside. Gunmen entered and began firing into the crowd indiscriminately. Hostages were taken. Panic and chaos erupted. It wasn't until French police stormed the venue that the assault ended, but not before immense devastation had been unleashed. In the aftermath, investigators uncovered a wide-reaching network behind the attacks. The assailants had traveled across Europe and received training and operational support from ISIS operatives in Syria. The attacks were not just horrific, they were sophisticated and meticulously planned. The events of that night exposed critical vulnerabilities and served as a harsh reminder. Terrorism remained a persistent and evolving threat in modern Europe. Segment. Europe's response. The Paris attacks catalyzed a massive overhaul in European security. Countries across the continent implemented stricter border controls, expanded surveillance, and deepened intelligence sharing among member states. At the same time, these changes ignited public debate. How far should governments go in the name of security? Could civil liberties and personal freedoms coexist with aggressive counterterrorism tactics? The questions lingered, even as new threats emerged. Segment. Thalys train attack, August 21, 2015. Just 3 months earlier, on August 21st, another terrorist attack was narrowly averted, this time aboard a Thalys high-speed train traveling from Amsterdam to Paris. The assailant boarded the train in Brussels carrying an assault rifle, a Luger pistol, and a box cutter. His intention was clear: to unleash mass violence on unsuspecting passengers, but his plans were foiled by the extraordinary bravery of several passengers, among them 3 Americans, Spencer Stone, Alex Scarlatos, and Anthony Sadler. They tackled El Kazani and subdued him before any shots were fired. Their actions saved countless lives and were later recognized with France's highest honors. El Kazani, a Moroccan national, was later charged with attempted murder and terrorism-related offenses. Investigations revealed he had been planning the attack for months. Incident underscored how lone wolf terrorists, individuals acting without direct orders but with deadly intent, remained a significant threat. It also sparked urgent discussions about transportation security and public vigilance. Segment. Rise of organized crime in Europe, Netherlands beyond terrorism. 2015 also saw a surge in organized crime across Europe. In the Netherlands, a country known for its progressive drug policies, drug-related violence spiked dramatically. Powerful cartels began to assert dominance over trafficking routes, and deadly turf wars erupted. The violence reached such alarming levels that the Dutch government had to increase law enforcement presence and devote more resources to dismantling criminal networks. These syndicates weren't just involved in drug smuggling. They engaged in money laundering, extortion, and even contract killings. The rising influence of organized crime groups quickly became a cross-border issue, prompting enhanced cooperation between European law enforcement agencies. The need for a unified Europe-wide strategy to combat organized crime became an undeniable segment. UK drug trafficking convictions in the United Kingdom. 2015 marked a significant year in the fight against drug trafficking. The National Crime Agency reported a substantial rise in arrests and successful prosecutions tied to large-scale narcotics operations. These victories were the result of long-term surveillance, intelligence gathering, and international collaboration. Authorities not only disrupted criminal enterprises but also began re-evaluating the country's broader drug policy. There was growing awareness that law enforcement alone was not enough. Prevention, education, and addiction treatment had to be part of the strategy if long-term progress was to be achieved. Segment: Italy and the 'Ndrangheta. In Italy, one of the most significant victories against organized crime came with the convictions of members of the 'Ndrangheta, one of Europe's most powerful and secretive criminal syndicates. The investigation spanned years and uncovered the organization's deep involvement in drug trafficking, extortion, and money laundering. The convictions struck a blow to the group's operations, not only in Italy, but across Europe, where the 'Ndrangheta had established strongholds in Germany, the Netherlands, and beyond. These successes demonstrated the power of cross-border cooperation and persistent legal efforts in the battle against transnational organized crime. Closing narration: the legacy of 2015. The year 2015 laid bare the complex and evolving threats facing Europe, from the coordinated horrors of terrorism to the corrosive influence of organized crime. The tragedies and victories of that year pushed governments to act, spurred policy reform, and inspired a renewed focus on public safety and international cooperation. But they also reminded the world that safety is not guaranteed, that vigilance, compassion, and unity remain our most powerful tools in the fight against violence and fear. Public vigilance became a critical tool in the fight against violent crime and terrorism in 2015. As Europe faced some of its most serious security threats in recent history, the lessons learned from these incidents profoundly shaped European policies and law enforcement strategies, with the goal of creating a safer environment for all citizens. In the wake of the devastating Paris attacks, the European Union took bold, coordinated action to address the growing threats posed by terrorism and transnational crime. Counter-terrorism agencies across the continent ramped up operations, aiming to detect and dismantle potential threats before they could materialize. These efforts involved collaboration with intelligence services from the United States, the Middle East, and other global allies. Within weeks of the Paris attacks, authorities in Brussels uncovered a sprawling terror network linking ISIS operatives in Belgium, France, and Syria. The revelation underscored the persistent danger posed by foreign fighters and the challenges of dismantling terrorist cells operating across international borders. In Belgium, the attacks triggered a wave of high-profile raids and arrests, especially in the Molenbeek district of Brussels, an area that had become infamous for radicalization. It was here that several suspects connected to the Paris attacks had lived, including the Abdeslam brothers. Key figures in the planning and execution of the massacre. Salah Abdeslam, one of the last surviving members of the terror cell, was eventually captured in Molenbeek in March 2016. His arrest marked a significant breakthrough in Europe's fight against ISIS-linked terrorism. However, Belgium's inability to prevent the attacks initially brought intense scrutiny, forcing the government to re-evaluate its domestic counter-terrorism policies across Europe. The response grew more robust. Governments moved quickly to increase surveillance, counter extremist ideologies, and improve intelligence sharing between EU member states. Stricter border controls and tighter security protocols were introduced, especially amid growing fears that terrorist groups could exploit Europe's open borders to travel undetected. But terrorism wasn't the only threat. Europe faced in 2015, organized crime also surged across the continent, particularly in regions where powerful drug cartels and criminal syndicates operated. The European drug trade had evolved dramatically, becoming more complex, globalized, and violent. In Spain, authorities battled an influx of narcotics from Latin America, especially cocaine and heroin. One of the year's largest anti-drug operations, codenamed Operation Tarzan, targeted a notorious Colombian drug cartel that had been using Spanish ports to smuggle large quantities of cocaine into Europe. After years of surveillance, dozens of cartel members were arrested in a coordinated crackdown. The cartel's influence extended far beyond Spain, with operatives and kingpins active in countries like the UK and the Netherlands. Meanwhile, the Dutch port of Rotterdam, one of Europe's busiest shipping hubs, became a focal point of concern. Criminal groups exploited legitimate shipping containers to smuggle drugs, sparking a rise in cartel-related violence. Turf wars erupted between rival factions battling for control over distribution networks. In response, Dutch authorities expanded their anti-narcotics operations, employing cutting-edge technology to track and intercept suspicious shipments in real time. One of the more unusual yet significant developments in 2015 was the conviction of the leaders of the so-called Mafia del Tartufo, the truffle mafia in northern Italy. While the name might sound benign, this criminal organization was responsible for large-scale trafficking in black market sales of rare and highly prized truffles, a delicacy sought by the global gourmet industry. Their illegal operations inflicted serious economic damage on legitimate truffle producers and included extortion, smuggling, and money laundering. After a lengthy investigation, Italian authorities arrested several key members of the group, disrupting what had become an unexpectedly lucrative criminal enterprise. But perhaps the most shocking and heartbreaking crime wave of 2015 was the explosion of human trafficking across Europe. A vast network of traffickers, originating largely from Eastern Europe, was responsible for smuggling thousands of men, women, and children into the European Union. Once inside, many victims were subjected to forced labor, sexual exploitation, and other forms of abuse. These trafficking routes often passed through the Balkans, using fake documents and covert pathways to avoid detection. The international scope of the operation made it difficult to stop. But gradually, European authorities began uncovering the full extent of the crisis. This growing emergency collided with another humanitarian catastrophe: the 2015 refugee crisis. Millions of people fleeing war-torn nations like Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq sought asylum in Europe. Traffickers seized the opportunity, preying on desperate refugees with false promises of safe passage and jobs, only to trap them in cycles of exploitation and violence. As the scope of this tragedy became clear, the European Union, alongside agencies like Europol and Interpol, launched a large-scale, coordinated effort to dismantle the smuggling networks. Targeted raids, stricter border enforcement, and improved data sharing formed the backbone of a new strategy, aimed at protecting vulnerable populations and prosecuting those responsible for human trafficking. The end. The refugee crisis and the rise of organized crime were not separate problems. They were deeply intertwined. Criminal syndicates capitalized on chaos, exploiting both weak borders and human suffering to enrich themselves. The European response in 2015 marked a turning point, a recognition that the fight against terrorism, drugs, and human exploitation demanded unity, vigilance, and an unwavering commitment to justice. Story 7. Europe and crisis: crime, chaos, and cooperation in 2015. In 2015, the European Union found itself at a crossroads, facing a tidal wave of interwoven crises that tested the strength of its institutions and its resolve. Amid surging migration, violent extremism, and the resurgence of organized crime, the EU began forging a new era of international cooperation, particularly with partners in the Middle East and Africa. The goal: to manage migration flows more effectively and dismantle the vast networks exploiting vulnerable people for profit. Despite The overwhelming scope of the challenges. European law enforcement achieved key victories that year, major drug busts, and the conviction of influential members of the Mafia del Tartufo served as reminders that the battle against organized crime was fierce but far from lost. These milestones reflected a broader truth. Cross-border collaboration and intelligence sharing were beginning to bear fruit, but terrorism and organized crime were only part of the problem as the refugee crisis peaked. The EU was thrown into political and social turmoil. Countries like Germany, Hungary, and Greece became flashpoints, with thousands of desperate refugees arriving daily from war-ravaged nations such as Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, while many European citizens expressed deep compassion. A vocal and growing segment often aligned with far-right ideologies viewed the influx as a direct threat to national security and cultural identity. What followed was a troubling rise in xenophobia, anti-immigrant protests, and, in some cases, outright violence. Far-right extremist groups, some with direct ties to organized crime, seized the moment they stoked fear, spread hate, and used the crisis to recruit disillusioned individuals into their ranks. Governments responded by tightening border controls. Germany kept its borders relatively open, standing firm on humanitarian principles. Hungary, on the other hand, constructed physical barriers and enforced strict entry requirements, turning away those seeking refuge. These diverging approaches revealed a growing schism between Eastern and Western Europe, and the rift threatened to shake the foundations of EU unity. In the background, a quiet revolution was unfolding in how Europe addressed organized crime and terrorism. The establishment of the European Counter-Terrorism Center, ECTC, became a major step forward, streamlining operations and intelligence sharing across member states. The ECTC helped coordinate joint investigations, monitor threats, and improve rapid response capabilities. But stability remained elusive. The Paris terror attacks, a foiled assault on a high-speed train in Belgium, the ever-looming menace of ISIS and other extremist groups. Each new incident reminded the world that Europe remained a prime target for global terrorism. The digital front became the next major battleground. Cybercrime exploded in both scale and sophistication. Hackers targeted everything from government databases to multinational corporations on the dark web, an untraceable corner of the internet. Weapons, drugs, and human lives were bought and sold anonymously. Europol and national agencies ramped up efforts to combat this invisible threat. But the borderless nature of cybercrime made the fight extraordinarily difficult. Financial crime also surged. 2015 saw the rise of complex money laundering operations and the misuse of online financial services. Criminals funneled dirty money through shell companies, fake charities, and offshore accounts. That same year, the Panama Papers leak exposed a sprawling web of tax evasion and illicit finance, implicating some of the world's most powerful individuals and institutions. The scandal sparked international outrage and forced governments to act. The EU introduced tougher anti-money laundering regulations, aiming to pull back the curtain on shady financial networks and choke off the funding sources of organized crime. In the UK, major banks and law firms were caught in the crosshairs, revealed to have enabled billions in money laundering. Public trust was shaken. Citizens demanded transparency. Investigations widened. To make matters worse, cyberterrorism emerged as a terrifying new hybrid threat. Hackers loyal to extremist groups used the internet to radicalize, recruit, and coordinate. Encrypted apps and social media platforms became powerful tools to spread propaganda and incite lone wolf attacks, further complicating the already fragile security landscape. Still, amid the chaos, there were hard-won victories. The arrest of Salah Abdeslam, a key suspect in the Paris terror attacks, was a landmark success. In parallel, joint operations across Europe led to the capture of several high-ranking drug lords and the dismantling of long-standing crime syndicates. These breakthroughs proved that persistence and unity could yield results even against the most sophisticated criminal empires. By the end of 2015, Europe had undergone a seismic shift. Terrorism, cyber threats, organized crime, and financial fraud were now deeply interconnected. The year left no doubt. Modern crime knew no borders, and neither could Europe's responses. The continent moved into 2016. The lessons of the past year would shape its path forward. The road ahead remained treacherous, but one truth endured. In the face of adversity, Europe would stand united, fighting not just for safety, but for justice. The fall of Robert McKean. Power, deception, and murder in Manhattan. From business partners to close family members, Robert McKean had cultivated an empire built on power, influence, and calculated moves. As a titan in New York City's ruthless real estate market, McKean was a name that commanded attention. He was a regular presence at charity galas, known for hosting lavish parties, and often seen rubbing shoulders with politicians and elite business leaders. His fortune wasn't just tied to real estate. He'd invested smartly in tech startups and global ventures to the outside world. McKean's life was one of unshakable success, but beneath the polished surface, he had a well-earned reputation for ruthless business practices and cutthroat tactics. Rivals described him as a man who would stop at nothing to win. Scene: the night of the murder, the night Robert McKean was killed, was hauntingly still. His assistant, who typically checked in with him each evening, grew alarmed when her calls went unanswered. Concerned, she used her spare key to enter his luxury apartments. Inside, she found McKean face down in a pool of blood. The opulent space, with expensive artwork and designer furnishings, was in shambles, suggesting a violent struggle had taken place. Early reports indicated that McKean had been shot at close range, possibly by someone he knew. The scene felt intimate, not random suspects, family and associates. Investigators quickly turned their attention to those closest to McKean: his family and business associates. Veronica McKean, Robert's wife, was the first to be questioned. Their marriage had long been troubled, marked by public fights and mutual allegations of infidelity. Veronica, a former fashion model in her mid-40s, had a known history of extramarital affairs, and their once glamorous image as a power couple had worn thin in recent years. Though initially cooperative, Veronica's nervous demeanor and conflicting statements raised red flags. Detectives placed her under surveillance and began combing through her financial records in search of a motive. Meanwhile, attention turned to Mark Graves, a former business partner who had recently been ousted from a lucrative joint venture with McKean. Known for his volatile temperament, Graves had openly accused McKean of betrayal and financial misconduct. Just months earlier, he had threatened to expose Robert's alleged involvement in bribery and money laundering. Did Graves hold a grudge strong enough to kill? Another potential suspect was Lisa Turner, McKean's longtime personal assistant. Turner, a bright and ambitious college graduate, had grown close to McKean over the years. Rumors swirled that their relationship had turned romantic, though Turner firmly denied any affair. She claimed she had been home the night McKean was murdered, but her alibi was vague and difficult to verify. Investigators began to wonder if Turner's connection to McKean went deeper than she let on. The will and the motive. A major breakthrough came when investigators discovered that McKean had recently updated his will in a surprising twist. He had left a substantial portion of his estate to a charitable foundation for underprivileged children, because he had supported for years. Notably, Veronica McKean was completely written out of the will. In his previous testament, she had stood to inherit most of his fortune. The change raised serious questions. Did Veronica know about this? And if so, could that have driven her to murder? Financial records revealed that Veronica was facing significant gambling debts and had sunk money into questionable investments. The image of a desperate woman began to take shapes, someone who may have been willing to go to extreme lengths to secure her. Future business betrayals and old enemies. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered the darker underbelly of McKean's business empire. His real estate success had been built on aggressive, often unethical strategies. Many of his former partners had suffered major losses after being outmaneuvered or betrayed by him. Mark Graves, in particular, remained a strong suspect, though his motive was clear. Graves had a solid alibi for the night of the murder. Phone records and witness accounts confirmed he was working late at his office on a major project. No fingerprints or physical evidence linked him to the crime scene if he had orchestrated the murder. He had done so through someone else. Sora found a way to cover his tracks flawlessly. Lisa Turner's role. Investigators were equally puzzled by Lisa Turner. She had been one of the last people to see McKean alive. Yet her alibi could not be independently confirmed. Her years of loyalty to McKean and potential emotional involvement made her a person of interest. Had jealousy, resentment, or knowledge of the updated will pushed her over the edge. Conclusion: a web of deceit. The murder of Robert McKean was more than a simple crime. It was a window into a world driven by ambition, betrayal, and greed. His life, though marked by success, had been tangled in deceit and manipulation. From a crumbling marriage to bitter business feuds and secret affairs, McKean had made more enemies than friends. As the investigation pressed on, it became clear that the truth behind his death would not be easily uncovered. The case exposed the dangerous reality behind the facade of wealth and power, where loyalty was fleeting and ambition could turn lethal. The search for justice in Robert McKean's murder would continue for weeks, with twists still to come. But one thing was certain: behind the glimmering skyline of New York's real estate elite lay a much darker story, one built on lies, power plays, and ultimately, blood. Story 8. The fall of Robert McKean. Greed, betrayal, and murder. Lisa Turner claimed she was home with her fiancé the night Robert McKean was killed, but no one could verify her whereabouts to the outside world. Her relationship with McKean had always seemed strictly professional, but whispers among McKean's colleagues told a different story, suggesting that Turner may have been far more entangled in her boss's life than anyone had realized. Just weeks before the murder, Turner had asked McKean for a substantial raise. He turned her down. The request reportedly led to tension that might have stemmed from something deeper than money. Some believed Turner was frustrated not only with her financial situation, but also with what appeared to be unrequited feelings. Her emotional outbursts during police questioning hinted at a personal attachment, perhaps even an obsession that had gone unnoticed until now. When detectives began digging into Turner's finances, they discovered a web of suspicious activity. Her bank account showed a pattern of small, frequent deposits, some traced to offshore accounts. She had also been spending large sums of money on luxury items, designer clothes, jewelry, expensive accessories. According to her, the money came as gifts from her fiancé, but investigators found no evidence to support that. His financial records didn't show a single trace of such generosity. Now, the motive began to take shape. If McKean had denied her the financial support she wanted, and if he had failed to return her affections, Turner may have seen the murder as a twisted solution, an end to her dependency, and a shot at securing control over her future. But without direct physical evidence, her involvement remained speculative. Then, the spotlight shifted as new information emerged. Attention turned to McKean's wife, Veronica. Their marriage had been rocky for years, but a bombshell discovery pushed her to the center of the investigation. Just weeks before his death, Robert McKean had rewritten his will, cutting Veronica out entirely. The move raised immediate suspicions. Veronica had a known gambling addiction and was drowning in debt tensions that had reportedly pushed McKean to threaten divorce. She had refused treatment in the days leading up to his death. She was spotted at high-end casinos, losing large sums of money. Her financial records showed a devastating pattern of compulsive betting and mounting losses. When questioned, Veronica claimed she'd been at a friend's house on the night of the murder, but, again, no one could confirm her alibi. Even more unsettling was her demeanor, eerily calm and detached. For someone who had just lost a husband, detectives were struck by her lack of emotion and her failure to grieve. Colleagues noticed it too. Then came another revelation. Veronica had contacted a divorce attorney shortly before McKean's death, according to the lawyer. She had been inquiring about her legal entitlements, specifically how she could still secure a significant portion of McKean's estate. Despite being written out of the will, she was angry, resentful and, in the attorney's words, desperate. But the investigation was about to take an even darker turn. The gun used in the murder was traced back to a local shop. It had been sold to an unregistered buyer. Just weeks before the crime, surveillance footage from a nearby camera showed a man in a hooded jacket entering McKinn's building around the time of the murder. His face was obscured, but he was seen leaving shortly after. Forensic analysis of the scene revealed a crucial clue: traces of a rare gunpowder. Residue were found on Lisa Turner's clothing, evidence that couldn't be easily dismissed. Then came the biggest break of hours before his death. Several calls were made from McKinn's phone. The number he dialed belonged to Victor Choya, feared and well-known figure in New York's criminal underworld. Choi was infamous for loan sharking, money laundering, and running an illicit gambling empire. His reputation was built on fear and ruthless precision to outsiders. McKinn's connection to Choi was invisible on paper. Their dealings appeared legitimate, but investigators soon learned that their relationship had deteriorated in the months before the murder. The two men had been involved in a high-stakes real estate deal, multi-million-dollar Manhattan property acquisition, funded by Choi and managed by Micken. But McKinn, it seemed, had made a dangerous misstep. He had attempted to cut Choi out of the profits. It was a betrayal. Choi would not forgive us. Detectives unraveled the failed deal. They realized McKinn's financial position was far more unstable than it appeared. The deal had collapsed, the money was gone, and Choi, who operated through intimidation and retribution, had been left exposed. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer the picture became. McKinn had enemies on all sides: a former assistant with emotional motives, a wife with everything to lose and nothing left in the will, and a business partner with the power to kill and the network to cover it up. Each suspect had motive, each had secrets, and in the center of it all was a man whose ambition, deceit, and double life had caught up with him. One fatal decision at a time: the murder of Robert McKinn and the disappearance of Emily Anderson Bate. McKinn had been trying to sever ties with Victor Choi and distance himself from the criminal aspects of their shared business ventures, but this attempt at a clean break didn't sit well with Choi, who saw McKinn as a valuable asset in his criminal operations. To Choi, McKinn's sudden push for separation was a betrayal, and one that couldn't go unpunished. In the days leading up to McKinn's murder, investigators discovered he had made several calls to Choi's associates. He was seeking a way to disentangle himself from the criminal underworld without destroying the empire he had built. One of the most critical pieces of evidence uncovered was a wire transfer from McKinn's personal account to one of Choi's shell companies, a significant sum that McKinn had intended as a buyout to pay Choi off and end their dealings. The transaction was made just days before McKinn's death, signaling a desperate last-ditch effort to make peace. But McKinn's plan came too late. Investigators later learned that McKinn had arranged a meeting with Choi on the night of his death, hoping to settle things once and for all. The meeting was set to take place at McKinn's luxurious penthouse. He believed, perhaps naively, that a final negotiation could free him from Choi's grasp, but instead of Choi, someone else showed up. Choi had sent one of his most feared enforcers, a hitman known only as Ivan the Hammer Petrov, a Russian national with a long history of violent crime. Petrov was notorious in the underworld for his ability to eliminate targets with ruthless precision and without a trace. Disguised as a business associate, Petrov entered McKinn's penthouse that fateful night. Forensic evidence later revealed there had been a violent struggle. McKinn had tried to fight back, but Petrov, prepared and lethal, quickly overpowered him. The fatal shot was fired at point-blank range, the angle suggesting McKinn never saw it coming. Petrov fled the scene almost immediately, erasing all signs of his presence. McKinn's assistant arrived just moments later, only to discover the grisly aftermath. Petrov's name soon surfaced in the investigation, marking a major breakthrough, but catching him would prove far more difficult. By the time authorities identified him, Petrov had vanished, disappearing into a global criminal network that spanned New York, Europe, and beyond. Choi, too, had gone underground, likely fearing that his own involvement in the murder would be uncovered. The investigation expanded internationally, working with law enforcement agencies across multiple borders. Authorities soon tracked Choi to as believed to be hiding in one of his known safe havens in Hong Kong, or Macau. Petrov, meanwhile, was reportedly spotted in Europe, but remained elusive. It became clear that Robert Mitken's murder wasn't just a local power play, it was part of a sprawling criminal conspiracy back in the US. Scrutiny also turned toward Mitken's wife, Veronica. While there was growing evidence against Choi and Petrov, Veronica remained a person of interest. Her financial records raised red flags, and her cold, unemotional reaction to her husband's death only deepened suspicions. Ultimately, authorities determined that Veronica's role was indirect. While she may have been driven by greed and desperation, she hadn't orchestrated the murder. She was later charged with conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to several years in prison. But the central focus of the case remained on Choi and Petrov, the two shadowy figures behind the fatal plan. Months later, the international manhunt reached a critical turning point when Victor Choi was apprehended in Hong Kong in custody and facing serious charges. Choi sought a lighter sentence by cooperating with authorities. He confessed to organizing the murder and provided investigators with key details that tied Petrov to the crime. But Ivan Petrov, the man who pulled the trigger, remained at large. The murder of Robert Mitken sent shockwaves through the business world, exposing the dangerous entanglement of legitimate enterprises and organized crime. It was a grim reminder of how far people would go to protect their fortunes, and of the lethal consequences of betrayal in a world where power and loyalty often walk hand in hand. Part 2. The disappearance of Emily Anderson. And the morning of July 18th, 2015, the quiet town of Aberdeen, South Dakota, was shattered by the sudden disappearance of 10-year-old Emily Anderson. She had been walking to her best friend, Megan's house just a few blocks away, something she did every Saturday morning. That morning was like any other. Emily's parents, Sarah and David Anderson, were preparing for a family outing. Nothing seemed unusual until Megan's mother called later that afternoon, wondering why Emily never arrived. Panic set in immediately. Sarah began making calls, hoping Emily had simply been delayed, but no one had seen her. When it became clear Emily was missing, Sarah contacted the police. A search was launched within hours. The town came together. Volunteers canvassed neighborhoods, searched parks and alleyways, and reviewed footage from local businesses. The initial hope that Emily had simply gotten lost faded quickly. Then, a disturbing piece of evidence surfaced. Surveillance video from a nearby convenience store showed a dark-colored van slowly approaching Emily as she walked alone. A man in a hooded sweatshirt leaned out of the passenger window, appearing to speak to her. Emily took a few cautious steps toward the van. Moments later, she vanished from the frame. The van lingered briefly before speeding away, though the footage was grainy. Detectives immediately suspected foul play. This wasn't a random act the van had been waiting for. Her Detective Brian Carter, a seasoned investigator with the Aberdeen Police Department, took the lead within hours. An Amber Alert was issued. Statewide news outlets picked up the story. Local schools were contacted. The pressure to find Emily intensified. Then, in the early hours of the next morning, a disturbing call came through at 2 a.m. Sarah Anderson's phone rang. On the other end was a man with a gravelly voice, composed but chilling. He claimed to have Emily and demanded a large sum of money for her safe return. He gave no further proof, no location, only a threat: follow instructions, or she would disappear forever. The phone call was brief but chilling. The voice on the line warned Sarah Anderson that her daughter Emily was alive. For now, if they went to the police, she'd be harmed. Then the line went dead. Tried to respond, but it was too late. The call had already ended. Investigators quickly traced the number, but it led nowhere. It had come from a disposable prepaid phone, untraceable, leaving no digital footprint behind. Despite the lack of solid leads, law enforcement acted fast. The FBI was brought in, deploying a specialized team to assist. Local authorities, their first hope was to track the number and triangulate Emily's possible location. But the perpetrator had been cautious. He made additional calls in the following days, each time demanding more money, offering no clues, and giving no room for negotiation. The voice was always the same, calm, firm, and experienced. This wasn't someone new to crime. He knew exactly what he was doing. As days turned into weeks, desperation mounted. Sarah spent every waking moment in contact with the police, begging for progress. David Anderson, Emily's father, hired a private investigator to follow any angle that might lead to their daughter Emily's disappearance. Gained national attention. The community rallied behind the Andersons, holding vigils and distributing flyers. But the kidnapper always seemed to be one step ahead. Detective Carter and his team pored over every available lead, focusing on hours of surveillance footage from nearby locations. Eventually, they caught a break. A man captured briefly on camera outside a gas station not far from where Emily had vanished. He was seen getting into a van that sped away moments later, though the footage was grainy. He wore a dark baseball cap and clothing that obscured his face, giving police just enough to begin narrowing down suspects with the help of witness statements and vehicle registration data. Authorities identified the man as 38-year-old Thomas Hayes. Hayes had a prior record, including assault charges, but nothing involving child abduction still. His recent behavior raised red flags. Phone records showed he'd used multiple prepaid phones, some linked to the same numbers used to contact the Anderson family. Investigators learned that Hayes had recently been evicted from his apartment in a rural town several hours from Enay. They began searching his known addresses and speaking with neighbors. After several tense days, police located Hayes's van parked outside an abandoned house on the edge of town. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Card team was deployed. They coordinated a raid on the property inside. Officers discovered a locked basement door. They broke it down and found Emily. She was alive. She had been kept in a small windowless room, tied to a chair while physically unharmed. Emily was visibly traumatized. She was immediately transported to a hospital for evaluation, and Miss Hayes was taken into custody without resistance. He was charged with kidnapping, child endangerment, and multiple counts of assault. During interrogation, Hayes admitted to abducting Emily, but insisted he hadn't acted alone. He claimed he had been following instructions from someone else, a man named Michael Walsh. Detective Carter was skeptical. Was Hayes just trying to shift the blame, or was there truly another figure pulling the strings? Hayes described Walsh as a ghost from his past, a man with a history of shady dealings. According to Hayes, Walsh had resurfaced recently, offering him a deal: help abduct a girl from a wealthy family in exchange for enough money to change his life head first. Hayes claimed he refused, but as his own life spiraled, unemployment, eviction, desperation, he reconsidered. He was promised an easy payout. Walsh even provided details on the Andersons' routines and financial status. He painted the abduction as a quick job with minimal risk. Eventually, Hayes gave in. He began Emily, learning her daily habits, when she left for her friend's house, where she usually walked, how long she stayed out. He studied her for days before making his move. It was calculated, cold, and disturbingly premeditated, as Hayes revealed more. Detective Carter couldn't shake the feeling that the kidnapping was just the surface of a much deeper scheme. Walsh, if he existed, had orchestrated everything, and he was still out there. The town of Aberdeen, once peaceful and tight-knit, was now haunted by the chilling reality that a predator had lived among them, and possibly still did, though Emily had been found. The scars of that summer would last a lifetime for her family, for the investigators, and for a community that would never feel the same against Hayes. Emily had seemed like the perfect target, and once the decision was made, everything began to fall into place. According to Hayes, the plan had been carefully orchestrated by Michael Walsh, who instructed him on every detail of what to do. After Emily was taken, Hayes was to keep her in an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. a place where no one would think to look. Walsh had promised him the ransom money would come soon enough. Detective Carter listened closely as Hayes laid out the chilling series of events. He said he had waited for the right moment. Following Emily on the morning of July 18th, the van, Hayes explained, had been critical provided by Walsh, along with the disposable phone used to contact the Anderson family. Hayes described how he pulled up beside Emily and told her that her parents had asked him to give her a ride. Emily Young, trusting, got into the van without question. It wasn't until she was inside that the weight of his actions truly hit him. Hayes spoke of a wave of fear and guilt. He hadn't planned to harm Emily, but the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. He drove her to the house, as instructed, and locked her in the basement alone and terrified despite his growing unease. Hayes continued, following Walsh's directions. He called the Andersons and made the ransom demand, threatening not to release Emily unless a substantial amount of money was paid. Carter could see the guilt etched on Hayes's face, but he also saw something else: intent. This wasn't just desperation. Hayes had made a choice, a tragic one. He had been more than just a pawn. He was a willing participant in Emily's abduction still. Carter was left with pressing questions. If Hayes had only been following Walsh's instructions, then who exactly was Michael Walsh? Where was he? Why was he still in the wind? As Carter exited the interrogation room that night, he felt a renewed urgency. Walsh was now the key to unraveling the entire case, but just like Hayes had before him, Walsh had disappeared without a trace. The clock was ticking, not just for the sake of justice, but for the safety of others. Walsh might still be out there, manipulating new victims. Carter and his team intensified their investigation. They began digging into Walsh's background, but found little. Hayes had spoken of him vaguely, an acquaintance from his past who had resurfaced recently after years of being off the radar. Carter's instincts, however, told him this man was far from ordinary. Walsh wasn't just a petty criminal. There was something far more dangerous beneath the surface. Digging deeper, Carter considered the possibility that Walsh had connections to organized crime. It was just a hunch, but the more they learned, the more it seemed to fit. Walsh had lived in multiple states, always appearing in towns known for criminal undercurrents. He had a history of shady schemes, blackmail, illegal gambling. He had a reputation for being methodical, manipulative, and dangerously persuasive. He didn't get his hands dirty. He got others to do it for him. Hayes, it appeared, was just one in a long line of pawns. The team began to re-examine everything, and then they found something that changed everything. There were signs that Emily's kidnapping wasn't the first. Similar abductions, same strategies. Walsh had done this before, and each time he refined his method. It was as if he had been rehearsing, perfecting a formula for something even bigger. Time was running out. Carter expanded the manhunt. He brought in federal agents and alerted law enforcement in surrounding states. Still, Walsh remained a ghost. It was as if he'd disappeared into thin air. Then, nearly 2 weeks after Emily had been rescued, a tip came in anonymous. The caller claimed to be an acquaintance of Walsh's and offered a specific location: house in rural Nebraska, just across the state line. The man said he'd seen Walsh there recently. He hadn't spoken to him directly, but had overheard a conversation. Walsh talking about money and something that sounded like plans for another job. Carter was cautious. Could this be real, or just another dead end? Walsh had stayed hidden for so long, it was hard to believe he'd risk lingering in one place still. It was a lead worth chasing with the FBI's help. Carter's team planned the operation carefully. They moved in before dawn. The house was in a quiet area. The only sounds were distant trucks passing on the highway. The stillness was unsettling. They surrounded the property and waited. Then came the signal. Officers breached the door and stormed the house, but it was empty inside. They found signs that someone had recently been there: dishes in the sink, clothes on the floor, and a half-drunk cup of coffee on the table, but no Michael Walsh. Once again, he had slipped away, vanishing just ahead of their arrival. Was furious. The disappointment weighed heavily on the team. It felt like no matter how close they got, Walsh was always one step ahead. Weeks passed, the case dragged on, despite new leads and endless searching. Walsh remained a ghost, but Carter refused to back down. He intensified the manhunt. They wouldn't rest until Walsh was in custody. In the months that followed, the case caught national attention. Media outlets covered every development. The Anderson family, though relieved to have Emily back, lived with constant fear knowing the man who had taken their daughter was still out there. Emily, though physically recovered, struggled emotionally. The trauma of her ordeal had left scars that might never fully heal. Carter and his team kept pushing, re-interviewing witnesses, re-examining evidence, following every tip. They weren't just fighting for justice for Emily, they were trying to prevent the next victim. Then, nearly 6 months after the abduction, another tip came in, anonymous, just like the first, but this one felt different. As soon as Detective Carter received word that Michael Walsh had been spotted at a remote cabin in the mountains of Colorado, he sprang into action. This was the break they had been waiting for. There would be no second chances. This time Carter and his team mobilized immediately, prepared to bring an end to a manhunt that had stretched on far too long. This time, Walsh wouldn't get away. His luck had finally run out. Story 10. In 2015, a chilling murder case sent shockwaves through the city of Manila, Philippines, a tragedy that left the entire community reeling. The victim was 28-year-old Maria Santos, a dedicated nurse at a local hospital and a beloved figure in her neighborhood. Maria was known for her kindness, her professionalism, and her unwavering commitment to helping others. Her life seemed to be on a promising path, until one November evening, when everything changed. Concerned neighbors noticed that Maria's apartment door had been left ajar, highly unusual for someone known to be meticulous and security conscious. When they entered to check on her, they made a horrifying discovery. Was dead. Her lifeless body lay on the living room floor, blood staining the carpet around her. The apartment was in disarray, furniture overturned, and clear signs of a violent struggle. It was immediately clear Maria had fought for her life. Oddly, her phone was missing, yet there were no signs of forced entry. That detail sent a chilling message. Maria may have known her killer. Veteran investigator Detective Ernesto Reyes was assigned to lead the case, a seasoned officer with a reputation for solving complex crimes. Reyes was struck by the disturbing calm that hung over the crime scene. Despite the violence, something felt deliberate. It wasn't a robbery. Nothing had been stolen. Maria's valuables were untouched. Reyes began by reconstructing Maria's recent life, interviewing family, friends, and co-workers. It soon emerged that Maria had recently ended a long-term relationship with a man named Rafael Torres. Rafael, a businessman in his early 30s, had been described as intelligent and ambitious, but also deeply controlling. Their relationship, once promising, had deteriorated into emotional manipulation and frequent arguments. Maria had confided in close friends that she felt suffocated and afraid. Some even believed she had begun seeing someone new, a revelation that had reportedly enraged Rafael. Rafael was immediately brought in for questioning. He maintained a calm, almost detached demeanor. He denied any involvement, stating he was at a business meeting the night Maria died. Several colleagues confirmed his alibi, but something felt off to Reyes. Rafael's answers seemed to polish. His calmness came off as rehearsed. The inconsistencies in his timeline, subtle but present, raised suspicion. Still, Reyes knew better than to rush. Emotion and motive were not enough. He needed concrete evidence. Forensics soon delivered the first break. Fingerprints belonging to Rafael were discovered on the handle of Maria's front door alone. That wasn't definitive. They had dated, after all, but combined with his erratic behavior, it raised the stakes. Then came the most compelling lead: cell phone records. Though Maria's phone had disappeared from the scene, it had been activated shortly after her estimated time of death. The location pinged near Rafael's office. Confronted with this data, Rafael's composure finally cracked, but only briefly. He claimed someone must have stolen Maria's phone and was trying to frame him. Detective Reyes wasn't buying it, but still, something nagged at him. Was Rafael acting alone, or was someone else involved? Reyes shifted focus. Instead of zeroing in solely on Raphael, he broadened the scope, delving into Maria's work life at the hospital. Coworkers revealed new information. Maria had recently helped organize a high-profile charity event. Her work had drawn attention from media and from donors, including one man who now stood out. Carlos Delgado was a wealthy businessman with deep ties to the healthcare industry. He had made generous donations to the hospital and had been seen frequently at the charity event. Often in Maria's company, some staff whispered that their connection went beyond professional, possibly even romantic when questioned. Carlos appeared distraught over Maria's death. He claimed they were only friends, nothing more, but Reyes wasn't convinced. Delgado downplayed their relationship too carefully. His answers seemed coached, his grief a little too performative. Suddenly, the case opened to a new, more complex possibility. Was this a love triangle gone wrong? Had Maria's decision to move on with Delgado pushed Raphael over the edge? Or had Carlos himself played a darker role in her fate? As Detective Reyes dug deeper, one thing became clear. Maria Santos had been caught in a web of obsession, jealousy, and betrayal, and somewhere in that tangled mess was a killer. Detective Reyes could feel it in his gut. Carlos Delgado was hiding something. As Reyes pursued this new lead, he began to unravel the tangled web of relationships surrounding Maria Santos's murder. Was Rafael Torres truly the man behind it, driven by rage and jealousy? Or was there a far more complex and sinister motive at play? This was no longer just a story about a possessive ex-boyfriend. It was about power, secrets, obsession, and a dangerous undercurrent of deception. Reyes knew one thing for certain. The truth behind Maria's murder was buried deep, and getting to it would require digging through layers of lies, emotion, and manipulation, with the possibility of Delgado's deeper involvement. Reyes realized they were no longer dealing with a simple crime of passion. Something darker loomed beneath the surface. While Rafael Torres remained the prime suspect early on, the discovery of Maria's increasingly close connection with Carlos Delgado shifted the entire trajectory of the case. Delgado's generous financial contributions to the hospital's charity event, the private meetings with Maria, and their unmistakable chemistry all began to raise serious questions. Could it be that Delgado's feelings for Maria had become obsessive? And if so, how did Raphael's controlling nature factor into the equation? Reyes turned his attention back to the charity event, the last major public occasion where Maria and Delgado had been seen interacting, speaking with event organizers and volunteers. Reyes got a clearer picture. Maria had been admired, dedicated, and deeply invested in her community, but something had changed in her demeanor. In the days leading up to the murder, she seemed distracted, withdrawn, as if something was weighing heavily on her mind. Some volunteers noted subtle tension between Maria and Delgado. Nothing overt, but enough to suggest a strain in their interactions. No one had seen an actual confrontation, but the sense was clear. Something was off. Maria's co-workers were hesitant to discuss the nature of her relationship with Delgado, but Reyes believed the silence spoke volumes. The pieces were beginning to align, and the portrait they painted was one of rising pressure and buried conflict. Then came a breakthrough. Phone records confirmed that Maria had been in contact with Delgado on the very night she died. A string of calls and messages had been exchanged between them in the hours leading up to her murder, but there was a noticeable gap, a sudden silence that coincided almost exactly with the estimated time of death. Whatever happened during that gap, it was likely crucial. Reyes called Delgado in for a second round of questioning. Delgado arrived sharply dressed, calm and collected, his polished exterior at odds with the weight of the investigation. He expressed sorrow over Maria's death, but his responses were measured. Too measured. Reyes had seen this before. Someone trying not to trip over their own lie. Delgado claimed their relationship was purely professional and denied any romantic involvement, but when Reyes pressed him on the timeline, cracks began to show. Delgado had previously stated that he hadn't seen Maria since the charity event 2 days before the murder, but now He admitted they had spoken the night she died. That inconsistency was damning. Delgado faltered for a moment, visibly thrown off it. Was enough for Reyes to see past the facade, and then there was something else. Delgado seemed uncomfortably curious about the crime scene. He asked questions, specific ones that no civilian should have known, almost as counsel. If he was trying to confirm details that hadn't been made public, the more Delgado spoke, the more Reyes' suspicions grew in the days that followed. Reyes ordered a full search of Delgado's home and office. It was time to stop chasing shadows and start uncovering real evidence. And what they found was deeply unsettling. Delgado's background, long thought pristine, was riddled with red flags. In the business community, whispers about his temper and possessiveness had followed him for years. Women who had turned down his advances reported uncomfortable encounters, confrontations that hinted at a darker, more controlling side beneath his polished image. But the most chilling discovery came from his private office. A personal journal inside were cryptic, obsessive entries, most of them focused on Maria. The pages revealed a man spiraling into fixation. He wrote of jealousy, frustration, and a need for control. In one particularly disturbing entry, Delgado penned, "I'll make her see no one else will love her like I do. No one else can protect her the way I can alone." Those words might have seemed like the ramblings of heartbreak, but in the context of Maria's murder, they took on a far more sinister meaning. Reyes brought the findings to the local prosecutor, though the case against Delgado remained largely circumstantial. The motive, the inconsistencies in his statements, and now, the journal painted a compelling narrative. Still, Reyes wasn't ready to rule out Rafael Torres. The two men, it seemed, had been circling the same woman, both fueled by entitlement and obsession. But Carlos Delgado, the respected businessman with a carefully curated image, now stood out as the man with the most to lose: his pride, his control, his facade. And when the mask slipped, Detective Reyes believed it might have cost Maria Santos her life. As Detective Reyes reflected on the case, it became increasingly clear that Maria Santos had been caught in a deadly crossfire between two men, one driven by jealousy, the other by obsession. This case was far from simple. It was layered with complex emotions and dangerous motives. Zaris understood that the investigation was only beginning to peel back the toxic layers surrounding Maria's life. The truth would eventually surface, but it would take persistence and courage to follow the trail, no matter how murky or perilous it became. Solving this case would demand more than just facts. It required a deep insight into the human heart and the darkness that sometimes resides within. Day by day, Reyes continued to unravel the web of deception. As he delved further into Carlos Delgado's past, unsettling details emerged, painting a troubling portrait of the man's psyche. Delgado's obsession with Maria had clearly spiraled beyond control. His attempts to dominate and possess her, combined with mounting frustration over her rejection, pushed him dangerously close to the edge. What once seemed like harmless journal entries now read like the thoughts of a man slipping into madness. Delgado had meticulously chronicled his feelings, almost as if justifying his actions to himself. The writings revealed a man who believed he was entitled to Maria, unable to respect the boundaries she fought to set. One entry stood out in chilling clarity: "I can't let her go. No one can love her like I do." Reyes knew this obsession had crossed a line that may have cost Maria her life. Still, the detective exercised caution. He understood that to secure a conviction, he needed solid evidence, not just a journal filled with disturbing thoughts. He returned to the forensic evidence with renewed focus.